The EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Tough year, really, hasn't it, in terms of trying to maintain anything really, but in terms of trying to set up new things, you know.
Oh, it's been insane. I mean, I was supposed to be in early 2020. I was supposed to be in Cannes with some a little team of mine. We've been working on a project for years and years and years now, which started out as a short film which we were going to take to Cannes, which is now, during lockdown, we've expanded it into TV script. So we hope to get some sort of attention for that, but we wanted to ship it around Cannes, you know. Didn't happen, obviously.
Oh, it's a shame. Well, I mean, we're all gonna have to make up for lost time in various ways, aren't we? I mean, I've certainly got my own little plans, you know.
Definitely. On the upside, it has given us plenty of time to expand the story and to make the project a bit bigger than it originally was. So, every cloud, I suppose.
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to have to make a point, aren't we, of like trying to promote a raft of things coming down the river in 2022, you know, just to make it up to everyone.
There's going to be a glut of stuff.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
Lots and lots of different people, which is fine by me.
Yeah, we might even get season 6 of Better Call Saul or something, you know.
Oh, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? That it wouldn't make it worth it, but it.
No, nothing's going to make it worth it. I accepted that a while back.
Anything, no, nothing's going to make it worth it. But that would be a nice light at the end of the tunnel.
Was it you who mentioned Better Call Saul the other day on Twitter about in regards to the Trump trial?
Yes. I mean, you must have seen the footage of the quote unquote lawyer that he had up, and I know obviously nothing. My opinion on any matters legalistic just mean nothing. But the man didn't even come across as a used car salesman. He came across as a clown, as someone who didn't know what they were doing or what they were saying, and was comporting himself in the oddest way.
Mm. Yeah, your more paranoid moments make you wonder if it's a kind of deeper level of trolling, don't you? That they've kind of hired like a comedy troupe, you know, like a minor Canadian improv troupe or something.
Absolutely. I was running through my mind, is this like a conscious gesture of contempt that's going on here? Conscious or otherwise, gesture of contempt it absolutely was.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it anymore. I'm sort of... in terms of political engagement, I mean, even just in terms of, you know, obviously it's not exactly engagement to just watch the impeachment trial across the Atlantic, but, you know, I'm sort of vacillating between just sort of laughing hysterically into the cheese grater and kind of hiding under the bed, you know?
Yeah, I must admit, during 2020, there were periods when I just bowed out. There was so much in the way of external pressures and extra factors going on that just for the sake of personal psychological health, it was a case of I am not going to read the trending bar on Twitter or anything to that effect. So I mean, that's primarily because throughout 2020, the theme of the trending bar seemed to be people or phenomena I genuinely think humanity would be better off without. Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I mean, yeah. That is a big trend. I've just moved to a new neighbourhood in South London, like from South London to another part of South London. So I'm actually going to go to, God help me, the local Labour AGM for that what do you call it, constituency.
Superb.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, via Zoom, obviously. So that's going to
obviously, yes, yeah.
even weirder than those things normally are. So, and also I don't know any of them really, apart from like vaguely on Twitter. So like some of the, I'll be making notes. You're just going, this guy's clearly an oddball. This guy's way too keen. This guy's politics are mental.
This guy has a cat filter, etc.
Yeah. This guy is a lawyer, not a cat. Etc.
Or as a fantastic comic doing the rounds at the moment suggests, it may actually be a cat pretending to be a lawyer with a cat filter.
Double bluff. I love it.
Which I rather like.
Yeah, that story definitely had what they call cut through, didn't it?
I just like the idea that it's cats all the way down, or filters all the way down. You could actually do a great existential science fiction story about that, couldn't you?
Oh, God, yeah.
Something percolating there, definitely.
Yeah, Charlie Brooker's taking notes, I'm sure.
Yes, episode of Black Mirror, definitely. Definitely.
I was going to ask you, actually, in terms of your, like, getting you through, particularly this, like, early 2021 phase of lockdown, which has been, obviously, utterly dreadful.
Yeah.
Are you... is there any sort of media you've been relying on to get you through, or any new ones you picked up?
Primarily video games.
Right.
I'm a huge, as you know, if you watch my channel, I'm a huge video games fan. And for some reason, I've really gone for some of the hardcore horror games, some of the stuff that's on the independent circuit at the moment, which is very much like horror in written fiction. That's where it's all happening. All of the innovation, all the interesting stuff is happening in the indie scene. And I've found some absolute corkers. I've got to say, there are some that I would consider some of the very best video games I've ever come across. There's one I'm playing at the moment, Visage, which is one of those games, it's one of those pieces of media that I absolutely love, but I know it's going to ruin me. It's kind of pertinent to what we're talking about tonight, actually, but it's when you come across those epoch-making moments, those pieces of media that just make everything else look like they've been asleep at the wheel for the last couple of decades. That's what this is. It's horror of a kind I've never experienced in a video game before. In the sense that it's actually horrifying. It's not like the jokey horror of Resident Evil. It's not even like the more disturbing elements of Silent Hill. It makes me reluctant to play it.
Oh, wow. Or like go to bed at night, or in the dark corridor, that kind of thing.
It's very rare that a video game has that effect, or in any media for that matter, where you're actually afraid of going to it, or where you have to limit your time on it because it's tensing you up, it's making you feel things. I love that. I love it. Although I have had many comments saying, "Why are you playing this? Why do you put yourself through this?"
Yeah, it's idiosyncratic, isn't it? Although I've talked to many partners and friends about how I think sometimes I tell them if I'm having a stressful month or week or whatever, I say, oh, I'll watch this thing, by the way, and they're like, why on earth are you subjecting yourself to that this week? And I'm like, well, that's kind of, I'm not claiming I'm unique or anything, but I think I do tend towards maybe the darker stuff when I'm not feeling good. It's like I wouldn't be the sort to stick on a rom-com or anything exactly. I'd kind of tend to sort of work through it a bit,
Likewise, I like, and I imagine this is simply because, self-psychoanalyzing, which is never a good idea, but I imagine it's simply because of my input, and I imagine that's true of a lot of people. I have sentimental attachments to works of horror and Disturbia, Kid of the 1980s, obviously, 1984, so during the boom of VHS. And what did my mother's VHS library consist of? Primarily, it consisted of lots of horror of the era. So I have a sentimental attachment to disturbing material, and I find it really cathartic.
Yeah. I mean, same to an extent. I mean, I think... quite harrowing kind of emotional dramas and things like that seem to be just what my psyche needs when I've had a bad week. I don't quite know why.
No, I'm not entirely sure what it is or what it provides, but it's definitely true. And I don't know about you, but I find that I absolutely crave it to the point whereby I will disregard a lot of stuff that markets itself as being disturbing or dark or whatever, because it just isn't. It's not enough. I want something that's really going to get me on an emotional level.
Do you think some of it's if life's putting you through the ringer, as it usually is, but particularly acutely, do you think there's something about sort of masochistically but sort of self-caringly wanting to put yourself through the ringer on your terms? Do you think that's...
It's really interesting that you bring up masochism, because I sort of commented upon that myself during one of the episodes of Visage that I was playing. There is definitely a masochistic element to it. Definitely, there is something about media. I mean, I've discussed this with Kit before. We did a commentary on Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. One of the very first ones we ever did, actually, one of the very first discussions we ever did. And we discussed how there is something about certain forms of media where they seem to feel as though the audience must suffer. But there is something terribly appealing about that. There is an audience for that, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, yeah. I mean, actually, as a result of that Hellbound commentary that you guys did, I rewatched Hellbound for the first time since I was a teenager.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, me and my brother, I think he'd seen it more recently because he's much more of a horror buff than I am. I was quite impressed because I mean, you'll find this ridiculous, but I actually remembered more of Hellraiser 3.
Hellraiser 3, yeah. I think we were really, really harsh to Hellraiser 3 on that commentary, and I don't hate Hellraiser 3. I'm not one of these people who is and I do know people who are absolutely livid about it, who just despise that film. I don't despise it. I think it would have been better served as a sort of standalone horror film that had its own little mythology that wasn't really attached to the Hellraiser mythos itself.
Yeah. I think the reason I went for it when I was a teenager was, or skipped straight to it, was it Terry Farrell in it?
Yes.
From Deep Space Nine.
Deep Space Nine, yes.
That's why I would have gone there, yeah.
Front and centre.
So also CD shooting Cenobites were just a bonus.
Yep, CD shooting Cenobites, and I believe a Cenobite with a camera in its eye as well.
Something like that, yeah. It actually kind of making me want to rewatch it, actually.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I've got the... the Lament configuration DVD set, where it's the box that actually is the Lament configuration, and it opens up and the CDs are inside. It has Hellraiser 1, 2, and 3 in it. So I do rewatch it quite often, and as janky a 1990s sort of popcorn horror as Hellraiser 3 is, I do enjoy it. It's fun, and it's got some moments that I think are fantastic. It's actually got some of the best lines from Pinhead. It's just that the film itself makes so many errors.
Yeah. Do you think you could look at it then as like the Hellraiser film that's made within the world of Hellraiser? So like, the way is it Scream 2 has is it that stab?
Yeah, I suppose so. Getting meta with it now. I mean, Hellraiser's at that point as a franchise where there are so many sequels, it may have actually done that very thing at some point, and nobody realizes or knows about it.
Was I can't remember. It might have been you or someone else I was getting this from. Is it the Hellraiser franchise, such as it is in some sort of bizarre legal purgatory where was it like for a while they had to keep making them, otherwise they'd lose the license?
That's exactly true. That's exactly right. That's why the last one, which it's called Hellraiser Revelation, but it may be, I don't know whether it's like number 10 or number 12 or whatever number it is. It's why it's so ghastly, even in comparison to the others. I mean, even the least of the sequels has things like a certain degree of production value going for it. So they're not awfully made, they're just terribly written. Revelation is just a mess. It's a terrible, execrable piece of work that only exists so that whoever produced it could hold on to the rights to the Hellraiser franchise. It's the only one that Doug Bradley passed on.
Did they get Garth Marenghi to do it?
Oh, that would have been great. I'd have gone for Garth Marenghi's Hellraiser. I'd have gone for that. I'd watch that, absolutely. My God.
While we're on the subject of masochism and video games, I dug out on the emulator this week.
What's that?
Lemmings 2.
Lemmings! Oh my God! What Tribes?
Yeah, that's the one. I've been going a bit mental on it this week. Any sort of downtime or empty space, because I never really. I'm 35 years old, and we had an Amiga 500 as the first computer we had in the house, and the original Lemmings is the only game that me, my mum, my dad, and my brother all played together. It's the only game that ever had that effect. So it'd be one of us would be steering essentially, and the other three would be yelling instructions, And when Lemmings 2 came out, I think I was just about old enough to kind of get to grips with it, at least get to grips with the controls and stuff, because I would have been pretty young, like 8 maybe at most. But I remember I basically just used to arse around on it a lot more than I actually tried to complete it, because they had those practice modes where you could try out all the new skills in these kind of like playground levels sort of thing.
Yes, and you could just basically import any one of the skills, couldn't you?
Exactly. So there's you could march around on the Egyptian level and just use the plant grower thing and the super lemming and things like that, and it's just, I think I spent a lot more time on that than actually trying to systematically complete the game. But I'm actually trying to do that now, work round the dial of the map.
You're actually trying to do it and get all of the pieces of the medallion.
I am, yeah.
My God, I mean, like you, the Amiga 500 was my very first computer. That was my exposure, And Lemmings, the original one, it was my mum's favourite, the only video game that she's played obsessively, ever.
Nearest my mum's come to that as well, actually.
I think I may still have actually all of the bits of graph paper that she wrote down all the codes for the levels on, because she did do it.
Codes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. She did finish it. I think she finished Oh No More Lemmings as well.
My favourite title for any sequel is Oh No More Lemmings.
And then there was Lemmings 2, The Tribes, which I don't think she actually did finish, because it's harder than the original Lemmings. It's much more difficult.
Well, it's not, I don't think, so I am actually planning to replay the original after this. I'm going to do it in the wrong order. But I think with Lemmings 2, it's probably, you may think this as well, but there's just a lot more faff in Lemmings 2, and it's all about showing off the new skills. And the problem is, obviously, because the original game's so well designed, the original skills are mostly just ways of doing those things in different ways or more complicated ways. So it's kind of, I don't know if it's more difficult in sense of solving the puzzles and stuff. It's just a bit more clunky. Don't get me wrong, I'm having a great time. But
it's a dynamic shift, isn't it, from the original Lemmings? Like, the original Lemmings is very refined, so there is always a very specific way of solving any particular situation with the tools that you're given. Lemmings 2 just gives you an almost sandbox approach, where it gives you just unlimited tools and says, solve the problem. And I think I certainly, when I was a kid, I had a real problem with that dynamic shift. I was trying to solve the levels as I would one of the original Lemmings levels, and I found that really difficult, but it is such a good game.
Well, it's also up to you. It's more open world in a sense as well, isn't it? In the sense that it sounds ridiculous to talk about Lemmings as being an open world, but it's more ridiculous in the sense that in the original Lemmings, as far as I remember, for every level you had a minimum save Lemmings target.
That's right.
Whereas in this, it's just purely up to you how perfectionist you want to be. So you can save the tribe by getting one Lemming to the end.
Yeah.
But it has these knock-on effects, so you have basically consequences. So there's a tribe where I've lost you start off with 40 lemmings and now I've only got 35, and I actually kind of miss those 5 every new level I go. I'm like, oh no, the lads, It's really, it's a bit more, it's a more grown-up game in that sense.
I mean, it really is, and it was a big project as well for Psygnosis. I always remember the box that it came in. It had the game with it, but it also had a novel with it.
What?
Yeah, it actually
right, halt the podcast.
Right.
I'm going off to read that.
Yeah, it actually had this very thin novelette in it that was the story of the tribes. And I remember it being very, very funny because it was basically a parody of The Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. It was written by J.R.R. Lemming, for example.
Got you. Amazing.
And there was even a parody of the One Ring rhyme in it, one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them. There was a Lemmings version of that. It was something like one lemming to bring them all and in the darkness mind them, or something like that.
I tell you what, if you can find a link to buy that online, I'll buy it. No questions asked.
Yeah, I'll have a look. I may even my bookcases are sort of off to the right of me there, and it may be over there.
Oh my god! If you find it, send me a picture. Honestly.
I know I've still got it. Still got it. It's actually quite fun. I mean, it's not any great shakes, but it is a fun little read. I remember laughing at it heartily.
I love stuff like that. I mean, video game humor from that period is quite adorable, really. In retrospect, I mean, I you know, do you remember there's a tribe of Highland lemmings?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm Scottish. My mum's Scottish, and I was just playing through the Highland tribe, and I sent her a picture today because like something like level 6 or something. It's called Brigadoon, which just made me chuckle into my cornflakes. So I was just like, that's great.
If I remember correctly, aren't all those lemmings like red-haired?
Yeah, and they stumble drunkenly into a phone box to get them home. And all the steel says like Clyde made on it and stuff like that. Yeah, it's really
Oh, that is brilliant. I'd forgotten so much about it. I always remember certain elements. Like I remember the music from the medieval stages for some reason, which is really, really good.
Some of the music's great. Like honestly, because I often play these games on mute or doing other things, listening to podcasts, etc. But some of the tunes, I think, like the Space Tribe and stuff like that, you know, it's all terrific. You know, the loading level, like the main menu music, is very annoying though. I'm gonna have to mute it for that. You know?
Well, Psygnosis always did very good presentation. You know, the production of their games is generally pretty damn good, even when the games themselves are a little bit shonky.
That's how much character they get into those lemmings as well. As I think people like proper video game scholars and stuff have written about this, but like, you know, the artistry in getting character into those little twitching pixels, so that you actually love the little bastards and want to save them. To
the point whereby they've become these incredible enduring icons. You know, people our age remember them very, very fondly. The history of them is fantastic. There's a number of documentaries by sort of amateur documentarians on YouTube. They started as a tech demo. They weren't even intended to be a video game.
Oh wow!
It was just Psygnosis playing around with little physics engines, and they invented these tiny little figures that weren't called anything to mess about with.
That's so weird, isn't it? It's almost like the universe, like an empty universe being built and spawning life.
Right.
Like demanding it. You know?
And of course it became, when they did cobble it together into a video game, it became easily their biggest and most enduring title.
Yeah. No, I mean, Lemmings, maybe that's another podcast.
I think it might. I mean, I miss my Amiga, I've got to say. I'm not overly given to nostalgia. I tend to try and resist it as much as possible these days, because I do feel it's become a very toxic element in our societies. Right. But I miss my Amiga.
Yeah.
I do.
I mean, me and my brother could barely play it. I mean, that was the thing. We got so many demo discs and stuff. If there was a game that we could easily work out how to play,
yeah.
You know, because my brother would. I said I would be like 7 playing most of these Amiga 500 games. My brother would be like 4. You know,
right,
5,
and they were often quite complicated as well. They often didn't have any kind of instructions or anything like that, and it wasn't just the control systems. It was the aim of the games. How you did anything was often kind of obscure.
Yeah, I mean, because you know we only got consoles after that, so apart from playing them a bit at friends' houses, they seem like a piece of piss in terms of control systems and stuff like that. You know, like playing Sonic the Hedgehog after that didn't present any problems. You know.
Yeah, hold right and jump a bit. That, you know, compared to an Amiga game, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it didn't even seem that fast if you'd had to go on Zool.
Oh my God, Zool! Yeah, Chopper Chops.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I've been really enjoying it, and it's kind of given me a bit of purpose as well. I'll tell you what, I was talking to you about media that's got me through lockdown. Not a game, but I got BritBox properly, like, you know, because I'd had a free trial earlier in the year, and I got BritBox about 2 months ago, and I've been watching a bunch of stuff on it, some old Peep Show, a little bit of Doctor Who, you know, some various things. But do you know what I've got really stuck into this week, and it's ridiculous. Did you see any of Vicious, the ITV sitcom?
Only bits and pieces. I didn't see the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi, yeah?
Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi, you know, doing just, I don't know what they're doing. It's like somewhere between doing it for the paycheck and a labour of love, and it kind of switches from second to second. You know, it's really because it started in 2013, which was that the year gay marriage actually became legal? 2013.
God, that's a very good question. I should know that, really. To be honest, it's terrible that we don't. You know, it's terrible that we don't.
But I didn't realise that ITV were sort of getting onto that, at that stage and doing this. Obviously, this very kind of storied version of it. But it's pretty fun. The I don't know if you remember, but their young, handsome, straight neighbour is played by the guy who plays Ramsay Bolton in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
And it's just, it's just the joy of having Derek Jacobi and Ian McKellen on screen. You don't really need much of a story or anything, really, do you? You just wind them up and let them go, and that's the joy of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me laugh at all the really basic bits, just when they swear or something. I'm just kind of guffawing and stuff. It's I've been seeing quite a lot of Derek Jacobi recently, I feel like, in different things, so that's been quite fun to sort of watch him in something else.
Well, that's always a bonus. It's always a bonus. I love Derek Jacobi. I remember when I was very young, there was like a rerun of I, Claudius on UK Gold, and my mother, just because she loved it from when it originally aired, I believe in the 1970s, and she was like, "Nah, you'll love this. You will absolutely love this." This story of like, Roman aristocracy and their perversions and whatnot. Yeah, you'll love this. Actually, I did. I thought it was superb. I thought I remember being in awe of it when I was young, just in awe of this show. I could not stop watching it, and of course, Derek Jacobi is incredible in that. Absolutely incredible. As is John Hurt. John Hurt's like a kid in it. It's frightening.
Yeah, he's ridiculous, isn't he? Because they give him like those. Even before I saw it, because I saw it, I was a bit older than you. I got the DVD set kind of at the tail end of the noughties kind of thing, and it was kind of on my list of canonical things to get around to doing.
It is one of those things, isn't it? It's almost enshrined in British TV culture. It's referenced so much. You've got to watch I, Claudius.
It's so intimidating that they've still not managed. That they've still not really managed to get the remake train running on it, haven't they? I believe there's some belated attempts in the sort of noughties and 2010s.
Yes, I seem to recall. I mean, did any of them ever air? Was there ever no? I remember hearing that it was being done.
I think someone pointed out that if you watch HBO's Rome, which was on in the mid noughties, then I think how does it work? Chronologically, if you watch Rome and then watch I, Claudius, you're kind of getting the whole story, because Augustus is in Rome as a young boy and then a man, in the sort of Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra time, and then so you can watch that, and then if you massively lower your expectations in terms of budget, you can watch I, Claudius.
Yeah. But I've got a real soft spot for television of that era when it is made for 50 pence and half a curly whirly. I kind of like that, the theatricality of it. I mean, a lot of the actors are obviously theatre actors, and those are the disciplines that they're bringing to the product. And it's very big and very sort of basso profundo. A lot of the acting is stage acting as opposed to TV acting. I kind of love it.
For kids, not kids our age, but people who were kids at the time we were kids. I think it explains, because we grew up watching quite a lot of 80s TV, and I think VHS and just repeats, and I think watching 70s TV explains 80s TV more, so you see where it came from. And I even found that I was talking to my brother on a previous podcast about the first series of The Blackadder.
Yes.
And I was saying that because we watched that when we were kids, even the first series, and I was saying to my brother when I then went, as a 20-something, when I watched I, Claudius, I was like realising that in part what Brian Blessed is doing in that is spoofing himself as Augustus.
Yep.
As well as being the Hawkman. I guess it's kind of like I described it as like a telepod blend of those two things. But you get those elements. Actually, Blackadder's got the other thing as well, isn't it? Because it's got the snake going across the chessboard or whatever.
Yeah. Of course. I mean, another sort of product of that era, which I returned to not terribly long ago, was the Chronicles of Narnia, the BBC Chronicles of Narnia, which I have enormous sentiment for. Those products are actually really beautiful. They're slightly ropey. They are, again, very little in the way of what would be considered budget these days, but at the time were absolutely revolutionary. I absolutely love them.
I was utterly terrified, and this won't be a unique experience, of the bit where the wolf attacks Peter.
Oh, yes.
Do you know where it all goes red? And
it's
insane.
They use some very strange sort of effects and whatnot, don't they, to create mood. in those shows. Yeah, it goes bloody, doesn't it? The whole screen goes bloody and strange, and yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I rewatched it probably about might have been about 8 years ago or something like that. But I'd forgotten so much about it in terms of the look of it and the aesthetics of it. Like obviously the White Witch, like the final confrontation with the White Witch in Lion the Witch Wardrobe was done like in a copse with about 8 extras.
Yep.
But I'd forgotten that they have these animated, like hand-drawn animated like griffins coming in and stuff like that. Do you remember?
Yes, and creatures scrabbling through the undergrowth and whatnot, and it bizarrely works.
Yeah, but it looks like a paintballing party is just going to go past in the background.
It kind of does. You would not be surprised to see a white van in the background at certain points, would you, really?
Yeah.
But I love that element of it. Again, you have this thing where everyone is clearly fresh off the theatre. Everyone. So the White Witch in particular, I adore her. The way she goes from very sort of sultry, seductive, and then just shrieking. Absolutely shrieking, where she herself is trembling with feigned anger.
That lady, I think she's called Barbara something. She's basically my White Witch, and even then, when I read the books and stuff, I'd then picture her when it was, Jardis in Richard's Nephew and stuff.
Well, she's very well cast because, of course, in the books, she is described as being this impossibly tall, almost giantess character, and yeah, she fulfills that very much so.
Yeah, 'cause she's like a kind of Snow Queen Boudica, isn't she? She's that kind of hybrid, I love this. I mean, my first book that I had really, which was beyond just a picture book. I've got a tatty copy somewhere, but it was on my, I think, 3rd birthday, and I kind of had it read to me more than I directly read it myself, I think. But then I got into reading through it. Is a copy of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but it's the TV series tie-in. So it's got a picture of the cast and the TV Aslan on the front.
Oh, that wonderful TV Aslan, the puppet. The animatronic puppet.
Yeah, that arguably doesn't hold up too well, but I still prefer it to the CGI one in the movie.
I prefer everything, absolutely everything in the BBC ones, to be honest. That film, it's such a hollow exercise, isn't it? They tried to make... They were riding the coattails of the Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potter cinema franchises, trying to make it simultaneously both. Of which it is neither. I mean, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is a completely different project. Yeah,
and their version of Voyage of the Dawn Treader that they wanted to make, and Silverchair had, the BBC, had so much character that I remember I sort of refused to go. Well, I actually refused to go see any of the movies after the first one. But,
I did see the film of the Dawn Treader, and it's absolutely terrible. It is absolutely terrible.
Don't pull your punches, George.
No, really. I mean, it's actually a bad film. It's not just a bad adaptation of the book. It is actually a badly put together film. They try so hard because, of course, the Dawn Treader, to be fair to them, the Dawn Treader is a very difficult book to adapt. Because it's structurally weird. The story is structurally weird. There's no antagonist. There's no through line. There's no grand quest in the Dawn Treader. And the plot is basically these islands where things happen, then sailing, then island where things happen, then sailing, then island where things happen. That's the structure of the story. It's basically like lots of little self-contained short stories married together by lots of sailing. And then some vague stuff about Aslan at the end. Trying to adapt that into a cinematic experience was clearly an exercise beyond them, because they try to shoehorn in an antagonist where there isn't one. They try to shoehorn in a sort of through line, a quest for the plot where there really isn't one. They even try to shoehorn in the White Witch, believe it or not.
Oh, you know what? I caught a bit. I'm sure I must have caught a bit of this on ITV2 some night or something. Yeah, I kind of vaguely remember that.
It's just not very good. Whereas the BBC adaptation of The Dawn Treader is actually excellent.
Yeah, I love Eustace getting turned into the dragon in the TV show.
I love that. My only thing about that is a problem I have with the book, which is why is that such a terrible thing? He gets to be a dragon. I mean, it's better than being a snotty little brat, isn't it?
Seems like a bit of an upgrade, doesn't it? Yeah,
definitely from Eustace, definitely. Although kudos to the actor who plays him in the BBC adaptation. He gets the hateful brattishness of Eustace down to a T.
Yeah, no, he really does. I remember finding him very punchable, even as a snotty 8-year-old myself.
Yeah, very punchable indeed. I think that may be why they cast him. I can imagine that conversation. on the casting couch. Well, he's hateful, isn't he? Let's cast him. I want to punch him.
There's a skill to that, isn't there? I remember, I think about a year ago, I was rewatching The Truman Show with a couple of mates, and I was the end bit where Truman's at the edge of his world.
Yeah.
For some reason, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader went straight into my head, because of the bit where they get to the edge of their world, and the sea becomes very shallow and smells sweet, and I was like, and then they have that wall that Reaper Cheap goes over and stuff. And it all came flooding back, and I was just like, that's something I need to revisit.
It's very well realised in the BBC adaptation, actually, because they keep it very vague. It's very abstract. You get this wonderful oversaturation of sunlight, and it all looks slightly unreal and dreamlike, which of course makes sense. They're approaching the edge of the physical world. They call it Aslan's country, which is essentially a metaphor for heaven, paradise, Eden, whatever you want to call it. And I really like that. I actually think it fits with the spirit of the books and the metaphysics of the books. And it's just a very interesting thing. It looks very beautiful on screen.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I wanted to pick your brains very quickly before we get onto our main topic here, actually, because I know you've covered this, and I'll direct people to your YouTube video that deals with this a bit more.
Of course.
You know how you did that series where you reviewed the Narnia books.
I went back and reread them all for the first time in quite a while, I've got to say. Very interesting experience.
Yeah, you weren't kind to some of them, I think it's fair to say.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, I always struggle with these books because, like yourself, they are incredibly important to me because they are the first real books that I read. I've still got. I can see them from here. They're on top of my bookshelf over to the right there. My mother's old school editions of the all 7 Chronicles of Narnia, they're all up there, and I love them. I really do adore those books because they inform the shape of my imagination. I wouldn't be the person I am without those books. I certainly wouldn't have the imagination that I do. I wouldn't have the interests or the obsessions that I do. And going back to reread them, I realised where a lot of that came from. On the other hand, there is and I think a lot of people have this experience with the Chronicles of Narnia. There is this incredible ambiguity because, as an adult, when you reread them, it becomes apparent what C.S. Lewis was trying to do with them, what the agenda was behind them, and the agenda is pretty execrable. It's pretty bad, But even that's ambiguous. I mean, I think the stories themselves are, in a strange way, stronger for having it.
Yeah, well, I was going to kind of pick you up on that, actually. I mean, not in a way that I don't find their moral message execrable as well. I do, but as someone who also was fascinated with them as a kid, and because you're a horror writer,
yes.
I was going to ask, do you not? Because you didn't really seem to find much of any good really in the last battle.
No.
At least in that reading of it. Do you not think it's a very good, despite its ideology, do you not think it's a very good horror story?
Oh, yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I remember even when I was a kid finding certain elements of it absolutely horrific in a very genuine way. The mass murder, the death of that book is incredible. It's not... I mean, it's something that you actually find in a lot of fantasy of the era. Like if you read The Lord of the Rings, there's insane amounts of death that occurs on a wide scale. There are wars going on and battles and so on and so forth. But not like this. The last battle paints a genuine apocalypse where it's not just entire species being wiped out, entire civilizations, nations, peoples. It's the world. A whole world is undone.
Kind of the multiverse is the implication, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And as an adult, what I find horrific about it is not the fact of that; it's the arbitrariness of it. It's the total arbitrariness of it, because that arbitrariness is actually echoed in The Magician's Nephew by the creation of Narnia. When you first encounter Aslan, you basically get the creation myth of Narnia, where he is just arbitrarily breathing Narnia into existence. That's what he's doing, and there's no rhyme or reason for it at all. It's just something that you have to accept as something that is happening, and whatever rules Aslan establishes are themselves arbitrary because he sets the rules. He decides what they are. So the fact that he's rolling up the universe in the last battle because it doesn't satisfy him, it's problematic. And then there's the more specific stuff as well. I mean, the
yeah.
one that gets me is I don't know whether you've ever seen, the fantasy author Alan Garner.
Yeah, is he the Weirdstone guy?
That's right, the Weirdstone of Brisingamen, Elidor, the Owl Service, all that kind of thing. He speaks extensively in a lot of interviews about C.S. Lewis, and he's one of the fantasy authors, and there are a lot of them out there who actually hates Lewis. And I mean, when I say he hates him, I don't mean that he disregards his work. I mean, he actually viscerally hates the man. And in one of his interviews, he said there are very few writers who he hates because of their work. But C.S. Lewis is one of them, and he calls C.S. Lewis a corrupter of imagination, and an abuser of childhood innocence. And I can understand where he's coming from, because there are things in The Last Battle, there are ideas in The Last Battle that are absolutely morally execrable. There's the infamous thing, which is the celebration of the death of children, which...
Yeah,
it's terrible.
It's not great.
It's a really. I even as a kid, I remember feeling odd about that. I didn't articulate to myself why. I couldn't articulate to myself why it felt strange and odd and bad to me, but it did.
It's sort of the death of martyrs in a way, isn't it? In the plot, in the sense that a lot of those children have been fighting for the Narnian cause,
right?
For seemingly no reason, because the world's about to end anyway, and that seems to be the design.
Right, and not only that, why are children fighting the battles of a divine being?
Yeah, do you imagine Aslan summoned a tank, like in Time Bandits?
Right. Well, or why does he allow any of it in the first place? That's the big question, isn't it? That's the ultimate question. If he's omnipotent anyway, I mean, this is a problem with the Narnia books in general, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example. The White Witch holds Narnia in tyranny for hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years, and makes it always winter, never Christmas. Then Aslan just turns up arbitrarily, and it ends. It just ends. Like, to the point whereby the White Witch doesn't even know that spring has happened. There's a thaw that happens. Her winter is destroyed, and she doesn't know. She isn't aware that that's what's happening. Aslan just does it by mere dint of his presence. And the question ultimately arises, well, why didn't he just do that? Why all the theatrics? Why all the nonsense,
Well, there's at least one theorist who thinks that Lewis was playing around with a bit more than just his Christian ideology in those books. Did you ever read that book, Planet Narnia, by Michael Ward?
No, never read that.
I think it's really interesting, and it's one of those books that sounds like it's going to be insane if you just quote the title to people, like it's going to be some sort of Da Vinci Code-esque conspiracy.
Yeah.
But it's actually just a book that, I mean, it's a very close critical reading of the 7 books, and it's also bringing in stuff from Lewis's other books where he's shown to be obviously a poet and
right, of course,
a classical scholar, and
yes.
to the extent he was, and it basically posits that every book of the Narnian series is tied to a particular classical deity / planet.
Okay.
I think you'd really dig it, actually, because it's not he definitely shows his working. He definitely draws a lot out of the text.
That sounds really interesting.
It's really interesting, yeah, because it's quite persuasive as well. Because for instance, he thinks that Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe is tied to Jupiter, and he uses that to explain things like the return of festivities and conviviality from winter, but also like everything from the nature of Aslan in that all the way to like Father Christmas making an appearance, for example.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and then things like the horse and his boy are tied to Mercury, so that's why you've got so much racing imagery and running, and everything's got to be moving all the time. And I mean, I'll let you read it sometime yourself, but
that does sound really interesting, actually.
Yeah, well, unsurprisingly, he ties the Last Battle to Saturn, and to Saturnalia and to death in that sense. And it's really interesting. All that, I mean, far beyond my pay grade to remember or quote any of it properly. But he brings out a lot of sort of classical poetic nods in Narnia that are kind of like children's first. But that his sort of overall theory that Lewis was essentially doing this for a bit of a lark, like a sort of high concept literary lark. I don't know how much justification there is for that, but it's a very persuasive.
As opposed to
mapping.
having like an overt agenda with what he was doing.
I think both can be true, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I mean, and certainly are in terms of the last battle. I mean, before we move on to the main topic of the podcast, because we should really, you know, we were talking about both the BBC TV series of Narnia and the movies. Is there a part of you which is sort of disappointed that neither of those series got onto the last battle?
You know,
just to see what on earth would have happened.
I'm more disappointed that they didn't do the Silver Chair. Because I love the Silver Chair is my favourite of the books. I think it's as I said in my review. I think it's the purest of the books. I think it's the one that's the most shorn of agenda, and it's just a great fantasy story. It's kind of a rollicking adventure with dragons and giants and witches and giant serpents and so on and so forth. And I love the BBC adaptation. I absolutely adore the BBC adaptation with Tom Baker as Puddleglum.
Yeah, that would have been my first exposure to Tom Baker, except for perhaps Blackadder 2, actually.
Right, yes, Captain Redbeard Rum.
That's right, yeah.
Fantastic. I'm just remembering the sketches in my head, and it's making me laugh.
But he's great as Puddleglum, isn't
he? He is so wonderful in that role. He just inhabits it. He gets the gloominess and the slight petulance of the character right down, but also the lovable quality of the character. He's definitely my favourite of the Narnian characters. I really, really love Puddleglum, and I like the arc that he goes on. You know, where he basically learns to be a little less pessimistic about things.
There's some great scary imagery in that one as well, because I've got this thing. I don't really know where this has come from, but I've got this thing where more than just it's rational to be frightened of larger things. I'm always quite scared of like giant imagery in things.
Right.
Like I don't know, some of it might come from the BFG or like the Cosgrove Hall BFG. Actually, come to think of it, I remember being quite scared of the giant in Time Bandits as well. You know, the one that puts the ship in its head. But there's a lot of, realised on a late 80s BBC budget, the giants that they meet about halfway through the Silver Chair. I remember being scared of them.
They are absolutely terrifying, actually. There's a few moments in the Silver Chair, and the Silver Chair does it more than any of the other BBC adaptations, where there's a kind of horror element to the framing of certain scenes. Like when the sequence that you're talking about, when they're walking along a place called Ettinsmoor, or Ettin being an old name for giant, obviously, so Giantsmoor, and there are these odd configurations of rocks along the top of the moor, and Jill stops and, in a very frightened voice, points out, if you look at those configurations of rocks in a particular way, you could almost believe that that's an ear. And that's a head. And then they start to move. And it's actually a really frightening moment. It's quite well framed, and the music is quite tense. It's really good. The Silver Chair has a couple of moments like that. You know, when they get to Harfang, the city of the giants, the civilized giants, as it were.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Which ultimately, it turns out, they want to eat them.
Yeah, the ones that's the to serve man bit of the thing, isn't it?
That's it. The man pie, which is a traditional part of the autumn feast, apparently, in Harfang. Sounds lovely. There's a sequence in that where Jill is harangued by Aslan, because of course the part of the plot of the Silver Chair is that Aslan gives Jill these signs that she has to recognise, and they're very cryptic. They're like riddles essentially, and all the way through the Silver Chair she's repeating the riddles to herself to remember them, and she forgets them. She forgets the signs, and she has this really surreal nightmare sequence during the first night of Harfang, where there's like a spectral Aslan haranguing her from the shadows, and it's really, really disturbing. It's odd. It's weird. Yeah,
and then obviously that bit. We'll stop talking about Narnia in a sense. But I remember being scared of the sort of green lady they meet as well. You know, who I think I can't remember if the show or the books make more of this, but there's kind of suggestions that she's linked to the White Witch as well, or is maybe of the same type. And
yes, if you read The Magician's Nephew in particular, she resembles very strongly the giants of Charn, which is the dying world that the White Witch ultimately comes from. That's
arguably my favourite bit in any of the Narnia books.
I love that sequence. The apocalypse of Charn is wonderful. It's vague as to whether this new character is one of those original giants who somehow found their way through from the apocalypse, or is even like a descendant of the White Witch. Because of course the White Witch was in Narnia from the very beginning, so it's entirely possible that she had generations of descendants.
Yeah, I suppose she feels a bit like a Saruman in a way, doesn't she? That green character, because she's got like an actual civilization going, hasn't she? She's got like an army and sort of industry going on underground and stuff. So
what do they call themselves? The Under Earth Men or something like that. The men that are sort of basically made out of the mud and the filth of the underground. Yeah, it's very cool. I love all that imagery. Is great. I love it to bits. I mean, there's a moment at the end of the first Harfang episode where one of the signs that Jill is given is that she must that she will find writing on a stone in Harfang, and she must do what the writing tells her. It'll be instructions. When they look out of the window of their room in the giant city, they see not writing on a stone, but gigantic letters made of like stone, gigantic boulders that are arranged into the words "under me." And the way it's framed at the end of the episode is weird. It's disturbing. Part of it is Tom Baker's performance, because he can be quite scary and intense. And it ends with Tom Baker sort of saying, "Under me, what can that mean?"
Yes.
And it's like, ooh, there's like ooh.
I suppose in a sense that's Tom Baker's master's degree after the undergraduate degree that was Doctor Who, right? So he's had this like 7-year experience of making ridiculous things scary. Yeah. and then you get him for the silver chair, you know?
Yeah, I never thought of it like that, but yes. But no, they'll never do The Last Battle. None of the adaptations will ever in a million years go anywhere near The Last Battle, in the same way they would never ever do The Horse and His Boy.
You know what? I'm snipping out that bit of audio, George, and I'm going to play that back to you in 10 years when they did do The Last Battle.
You know what? If they do it, it'll be butchered. That's the sad thing. If they do it, it's going to be very difficult to do it with any fidelity.
Well, you know what I wanted, or not really wanted. But you know what I'd be fascinated to see is, and this would be evil. But like what I want to see is, like for the rights for it to get so cheap or so degraded, or like the major studios to pass on it so much that what the people who get hold of it are one of those like fringe church groups.
Oh my god!
So that they actually, I know, and I know the idea of kids actually being subjected to that is horrible. But you know what I mean? Like to see a proper version of it where they actually do it, and it's insane. But also on a budget.
Yeah, sort of like the Left Behind films or that kind of thing. Yeah,
no, I'd watch that. I'd genuinely watch it. I'd probably destroy it afterwards. But
I wouldn't be able to resist. I'd have to watch it. And you are right. They are probably some of the only production studios that would do it with any fidelity to the original text. So I mean, they may even do The Horse and His Boy, given how Islamophobic it is.
I was going to say, ironically, those sorts of Christian studios might actually steer more tactfully clear of the racism than any of the apocalyptic stuff, because even they kind of pitch themselves a bit more mainstream, at least in terms of that sort of stuff.
Well, you have to bear in mind, I mean, that was passed over even in the 1980s,
Yeah.
Even in the 1980s. And I guarantee you that was the reason why. Because The Horse and His Boy is relatively easy in comparison to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, even Prince Caspian. It's much easier to film than most of the Chronicles of Narnia. Because there's nothing very big in it. There's no massive special effects required. Even some of the more fantastical animals, like the talking horse of the title, is just a horse. It's not that difficult to do. They passed on it because of the overt racism.
It's a bit overt, isn't it? It's a tad overt.
It's fairly overt. It's the collapsing of like so many Arabic cultures into just one thing, where Lewis doesn't seem to understand the difference between Sikhism, various forms of Islam, Buddhism, and various other cultures of the area. It just collapses them all together into these really fairly awful stereotypes.
I'd love to meet a Muslim friend who actually loved the Chronicles of Narnia growing up. It'd be such an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. It is. I think it's very easy to sound like that you're condemning these things wholesale because they have these elements that are just terrible. They're absolutely appalling. That's not the case. I still have enormous affection for all those books, like enormous affection, but I do recognise their faults. I mean, it's the same with The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is in no way as overt as the Chronicles of Narnia, but it still has a lot of elements which are very questionable. when you come at them from a particular perspective.
I sometimes wonder, actually, because I grew up obviously marinated in Christian culture to the extent that we all are, but
Of
basically atheist with parents who didn't care.
Likewise.
So I wonder if I would have had more of a violent reaction against the Chronicles of Narnia books in later life if I'd been actually, had strict Christian parents and gone to a Christian school and maybe had to sort of play at being Christian until my early 20s, for example.
I think that's quite likely. I mean, I do know people where that is exactly their experience. That is exactly their experience. A very good friend of mine was raised in Ireland. Very, very Catholic family, very Catholic background, and is very angry. He's still a very angry atheist now, much more so than I am or ever was, I think.
Because you and I possibly have the relative privilege of treating the Narnia books as a bit of a theme park, or like a kind of ghost train we can revisit.
Pretty much. It's abstract, isn't it? It doesn't have any personal resonance as such. There's certainly nothing that's going to trigger association.
Yeah, no elderly relative's going to force me to believe that stuff, or say that I should take them seriously, more seriously than I want to, or anything like that. It's
well, I mean, just like my friend says, he defines as an atheist and very much an atheist, but he always says you're never not a Catholic when you've been raised in that environment. You are never not a Catholic. He can still recite the catechisms and all sorts of things. It's just burned into his memory.
I'm the same with Terry Pratchett, That'll take a good load more Valium to shift. You know what, George? I'm gonna start the episode properly in a sec.
No problem. Yes, so I mean, in a kind of way, there's a very natural segue there. I mean, we talked about C.S. Lewis, we talked about Tolkien, and if Tolkien and Mervyn Peake are often regarded as sort of like the two primary roots of British fantasy, or postmodern fantasy anyway.
Yeah, and what we're gathered today to talk about is, arguably the third pillar there, or at least the fans would have that.
The thing I really like about podcasts, almost any subject, is I like to get the experiential element of them. I like to know what people's backgrounds are about the topic and the subject and how it's affected them. I don't like the more sort of technical ones.
Yeah, or ones that are just kind of recap based, and I mean that's fine for something you yourself have just seen, like maybe an episode of a TV show that was on the night before, for example. But when you're talking stuff from deep time,
going right back to Chronicles of Narnia there again.
The deep magic.
The deep magic, yeah. I mean, I listen to a lot of Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 podcasts. I do one with my friend Adam Nicol, actually. We do one called The Fluff and Hammer. And
I've seen that title crop up on YouTube.
So much fun. But that area, there are so many of those podcasts that they're very good for what they do. They're very good for what they do, which is where they talk about the rules, they talk about updates, and they talk about stuff, very, very technical stuff. But that just isn't for me. It's not for me.
You might have seen the same thing doing the rounds on Twitter, or you might have listened to it yourself, but there's my friend Nanina, who was on the last episode of this podcast. She recommended this podcast that a few people talk about at the moment, about Lolita. Have you seen this?
No, I haven't.
I'll send you a link afterwards. It's a 10-part podcast by a female American critic, and she's done this whole series about Lolita where she talks about the book, but then about its effect on sort of late 20th century pop culture, including both major movie adaptations, a whole bunch of weird stuff like Lolita the Musical, which I hadn't heard of.
I did not even know that existed, and now that I know it exists, I don't know how to feel about it at all.
No, it's crazy. And she gets into its permeation into pop culture, everything from, Britney Spears to kind of, weird fashion sort of niche circles and internet hangouts and stuff.
Wow.
Train that culture. It's really interesting, and I recommend it. But in terms of and actually I was going to say this to Nina as well when I feed back to her about it, it's quite slick because it's obviously got a bit of money behind it, and it's kind of, it's got probably a production team rather than just some bloke doing it on Audacity, and that just kind of this makes me sound really like punk when I'm totally not, but in terms of this aesthetic, the kind of podcasts that made me really passionate about this aren't that, they are usually monologues or dialogues, and they're usually very, very minimally produced to the point of making it a point of pride. And it's kind of, that's just what I consider to be a proper podcast now, and I can't take that away. So when I hear something like that, which is very interesting, this Lolita show, very interesting, it's more like I'm listening to a Radio 4 thing on BBC Sounds,
Yes,
which is fine, but it's just not what I think of as podcasting.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, it's not a condemnation of that type of podcasting. If that's what people go for, then absolutely fine. But for me, it's just not my thing.
Do you think this is the equivalent of like we've learned 3 chords and we're going to use it? We're just going to keep going.
Yeah, I think that might be it. But my God, I'm so intimidated by the subject we've got on for this evening. I'm so intimidated by it.
Yeah. No. Well, let's start off then, because you know what? I'll very nominally introduce the show.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to episode 26 of the EscapeGoat podcast. You're listening to me, David Fagiani, in conversation with George Lee. I wanted to talk to him about a subject close to both our hearts, it turns out, from
absolutely.
From Twitter conversations. But we're going to zoom in because it's such, as George says, it's such potentially a huge topic, and there's such a lot to it that we're going to zoom in on a particular adaptation of this work, which is maybe a little bit under-examined, I think, and certainly under-available.
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, I think that's true of the subject in general.
Yeah, and so we'll zoom in on an under-examined part of a perhaps under-examined thing. This is, of course, Gormenghast by the author Mervyn Peake. And we're going to particularly look at the BBC adaptation of Gormenghast from the year 2000.
Yes.
It aired in early 2000, and this is something that both George and I saw when it was on, I believe.
To a crumbling dynasty comes a new life.
Have you ever delivered a more hideous child?
Never, my lord, never! Bring him in now, you idiot!
Pinched nose, flat head, weird eyes. He is my little brother.
You shall be consecrated as Titus, Lord of Gormenghast.
Bring him back when he's 6.
Starting tonight at 9, Gormenghast on BBC Two.
The time has come.
George, I mean, we had a bit of chat about this off air, as it were, but would you like to tell me a bit about not only seeing this for the first time, and obviously we'll get more into detail about the show, but then how that led you into the books of Mervyn Peake? Absolutely.
I mean, I was so surprised when I discovered Gormenghast, and I discovered it through the BBC show. I'd never heard of it before. And that was very, very surprising to me, because my entire childhood, pretty much from the first conscious thought on, was steeped in the stuff of fantasy. So it was The Flight of Dragons, The Lord of the Rings, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, The Chronicles of Narnia, it was Discworld, later on it was Neil Gaiman. It was just this seething cauldron of the fantastical and the dreamlike. And I don't know how I never, ever heard of Gormenghast. I find that, even to this day, I find it bizarre. And then I remember seeing an advert on the BBC for this lurid, strange-looking work of fantasy with this incredibly evocative title, Gormenghast. I was like, what on earth is that? And seeing the cast for it and thinking that is for me. That's for me. I have to see what this is. And of course, I mean, we were talking about the year 2000, and I don't know whether you remember what UK television was like back then, but mainstream UK television was pretty dreadful. It was pretty dire. It was primarily soaps, very bland social tracts, and reality television, by and large. There are a few exceptions and oases, but there were very few and far between.
I think you're doing Dinner Ladies a disservice there, George. Come
on. Yeah, of course. But then you had this turning up, which was so out of left field, so unlike anything else the BBC were producing at the time. And I remember watching the first episode and finding it so strange, but in the most pleasant way imaginable. I was hooked. I was totally hooked. I loved the absurdity of the characters, the theatricality of it, the production of the thing. It clearly had enormous amounts of money thrown at it, just enormous amounts of money. The sets alone are phenomenally impressive. But I did fall in love with it. I fell in love with the characters more than anything. I loved the characters, and I think that is the thing with Peake's writing, to be perfectly honest. The characters are where it's at. They're the core of it. The show I absolutely adored and became quite besotted with for quite a while, right into my university years. And when I was at university, I used a lot of my student loan buying books that were nothing to do with anything that was on any of my courses. One of which happened to be a big collection of the Gormenghast books. So it had Titus Groan, Gormenghast, and the third book, Titus Alone, in it. And read them, and it was one of those events, when you encounter certain kinds of media that change your perspectives on what media is, on what stories are. And for me, it was how fantasy works. Up until that point, the previous books that had done that for me were the Chronicles of Narnia, which were the first ones I ever read, the Lord of the Rings, which I adored throughout a significant period of my childhood, like maybe a bit too much. Maybe a little bit too fanatical on that, when you're getting sort of like, when you're a very young child and you're getting Lord of the Rings and Tolkien atlases and maps and things, and that's it, that's what you're getting instead of toys and things. I don't know.
The Discworld map, I had that.
Yes, it's sort of like, maybe that's a little bit too obsessive. But then I read Clive Barker's Weave World at the age of 11. And that shattered my preconceptions of what fantasy fiction was. And I think that experience also led in to what eventually drew me to Gormenghast, because Gormenghast is such a different form of fantasy from almost any of the others that I've mentioned there. What I find fascinating about it is it's generally regarded as one of the primary roots of British postmodern fantasy. There's that, and there's the Lord of the Rings. They're often compared and contrasted to one another. But even if you go to academics who specialize in fantasy fiction, in postmodern fantasy fiction, and you ask them to reel off the iconic tropes and subjects of fantasy, you are likely to get an answer that Gormenghast contains none of. Absolutely none of. There's no fantastical creatures. There's no magic. There's no gods. There's no notion of fate or anything to that effect. Even the kingdom itself is not necessarily fantastical. It's kind of a very real world that Mervyn Peake draws.
It's like the classic example of a literary thing, isn't it? Those puzzles or challenges of describe a chair in a way that includes everything that is a chair and excludes everything that isn't.
Right.
This is a fantasy somehow, despite not meeting that description.
Despite the fact that it kind of meets none of the criteria of a fantasy. It's so strange in that regard. Like it is Antipodean. When you compare and contrast it to The Lord of the Rings, it's Antipodean. It's exploring a very different kind of fantasy to The Lord of the Rings. And the interesting thing is, most people know what The Lord of the Rings is. Even before the film adaptations, most people would know what a Hobbit was, or they'd know Gollum, or some of the iconic elements of The Lord of the Rings, because it's so saturated in culture. It's so much part of what British culture is and literary tradition. Most people, even now, don't really know what Gormenghast is.
Yeah, because we're going to be looking at the BBC TV series, which is like its most high-profile exposure to a mainstream audience to date.
Pretty much.
And it still didn't become, it's because I think partly just because it was a 4-part limited series, so there was no sense of it becoming embedded in the way that the Doctor Who revival did, for example.
Yeah.
People who caught it were struck by it and liked it, but then it just disappeared a little bit. And it's kind of, I've been talking about various shows on this that have cropped up on things like BritBox recently or Amazon Prime and stuff. This does not appear to be in the queue.
No, I can imagine it wasn't. I know that the BBC, they really wanted it to succeed. It was a massive project. When the series hit, there was all sorts of franchise stuff. There was jewelry based on it. There were clothing lines based on it. There was music. There was all sorts of stuff. They thought that this was going to be huge. And it really wasn't. It's sort of become a quiet cult hit in the years since. Certain people remember it fondly, and that's it. That's as far as it ever went. And I think part of that may be just due to the source material. It is a very, very hard story to adapt.
I mean, you said that, because I saw this same advert, so I was thinking back to the chronology of this in early 2000, and I would have been in year 9 at high school, so pre-GCSEs.
Yeah.
And I remember being fascinated by the look of it as well. And I guess this is the weird thing, because this comes out, is it like a year before the theatrical Lord of the Rings movies start coming out? Yeah, so I had my background with fantasy was largely Pratchett, so I was kind of coming at it from the parody, when you sort of back into a genre from the parody. And I think to the extent that I saw something to be fascinated with in Gormenghast, just beyond the aesthetics of those adverts, it was probably something like the period dramas that I'd watched with my mum, but with that skewed, hyper-real kind of look to it, and I was kind of fascinated by that. But you were talking about the actors and wanting to leap on board with that. I was trying to think back, because we'll obviously talk about some of the actors specifically, but I was trying to think how aware I was of any of these now canonical and often now dead actors who are in Gormenghast.
Yes, of course.
Because it was if I was about 14, it would have been at the time when I was really voraciously starting to like work through old VHSs of kind of more adult movies and stuff like that. And I think, so for example, Richard Griffiths, who's in it, who plays Swelter, I probably had just watched Withnail.
Right, of course.
Like maybe that year. And like
Uncle Monty.
Uncle Monty, yeah.
Uncle Monty.
And Christopher Lee, who we'll talk a bit about his appearance in this,
wow.
especially coming as it does. Maybe just before he filmed Lord of the Rings, or just afterwards?
Oh yeah, just before. I mean, in many respects, it's such a shame that Gormenghast came out when it did, because if it had come out after the Lord of the Rings, when there was this incredible swell of interest in fantasy, it might have done a little bit better.
Imagine they just parked it for a year, like even just filmed it when they did and just released it a year later.
Right. It might have worked then. It might have worked. It's such a shame that it did come during this kind. I remember being, I mean, I was, how old was I? I think I was like 19. And it came at this time when UK television was in kind of the doldrums. Everything was very literal, everything was very realist. There wasn't really much of an inclination towards the fantastical in popular culture at that time. And I do think a lot of people watched it and just thought, oh, this is weird, this is strange, I don't like it, and turned back to whatever soap opera they were watching or whatever reality television program they were watching, Big Brother or whatever. And I mean, I was a bit more of an angry, snipey young man back then, and that I remember saying to my mum, like ranting about that very phenomena. Oh, this is why people are saying this about Gormenghast. It's because the general culture is so lacking in imagination and whatnot. Which was probably unfair. It was probably just poor timing, No,
that's all right. I was about the same age, and I had a few rants about Love Actually around the same time. So I don't, we're much cuddlier now.
Definitely,
I'm literally much cuddlier now in a physical sense. I mean, it is odd though. It's an odd show because we'll talk more about the show and our experience rewatching it now. But I was struck even at the time by the intensity of it, and that's everything from the style to the music, isn't it? And the kind of and the performances, which are kind of, I mean, like some of them verge on the gonzo, really, don't they?
Absolutely, they do. I mean, and again, that does derive from the source material. When you read the book of Gormenghast, the interactions, even the ones that are just transitional, that don't really mean anything, are phenomenally intense. And often have these layers of subtext going on, where the characters come away from them and then have these moments of interiority where they start thinking about, why did I have that interaction? What does this mean? What will the ripples and after effects of this be? I mean, even the very first interaction in the book, which is between Flay and a character who is kind of in the adaptation but is changed into another character, a character called Rockcod, who in the book is the keeper of bright carvings. He's the guy who looks after all of the carvings that the carver tribes make when they're all sort of stored away in a big attic. That's where he lives, basically. His whole life is spent in this attic dusting the carvings that the carvers make, and he's quite happy. That's his life. And Flay goes to talk to him, and nobody's gone to talk to Rockcod for years. He's lived on his own, just getting his meals via this dumbwaiter that comes up. And he's quite happy with that. So there is this really strange opening segment to the book, which is fraught with all manner of strange tensions and it's commented upon. Like, the characters think about this when they're interacting with one another. Rotcod is like, why has someone, Flay of all people, who doesn't talk to anyone, why has someone disturbed me? Why has someone violated the purity of my world, you know? And then,
you know what, if they'd put him in the show in 2000, I would have cast Mark Heap.
I think it probably would have worked quite well, you know. Yeah, I mean, what they do in the show is they just take the name and they apply it to a character who turns up later. And they do that quite a lot, actually, because there are lots of sort of ancillary characters who wander around Gormenghast who it wouldn't have been worth casting because they turn up and they go away again.
I should say, actually, George, I'm going to call on you to talk a little bit about the difference between, the sort of basic differences between the show and the books.
There are quite a few. The essence of the book is there. The essence of the book is there. There are just things that are shifted around. There are certain things like time-wise, in terms of time frame, that happen earlier or later to make the story make more sense in a televisual sense. I mean, it's the same with most adaptations, really. The biggest thing is that time is contracted in the TV series. The book takes place over a much longer period. So when Steerpike, for example, turns up in the kitchens, he's like a kid. He's about 14, I think, when he originally occurs, and that's quite disturbing in and of itself, given what he's like. You know, the fact that it's this 14-year-old who's going around murdering people and spinning these incredibly labyrinthine Machiavellian plans. But by the end of the story, he's about 20-something, you know, so it's a massive, massive span of time. The series kind of contracts that a little bit. Yes,
yeah. I was actually wondering that on this rewatch. And you know what, before we talk about that, I'll just say, for anyone who's sort of casually listening to this, you never know, they might exist.
They might.
I should say the BBC, the 2000 BBC adaptation of Gormenghast is based on the first two books in the sort of loose Gormenghast trilogy, and I suppose they are the core part of it, really, aren't they? They're the core part of the books that happens in Gormenghast.
When people talk about Gormenghast, they usually mean the first two books, because the story kind of ends. It does really end with the conclusion of the second book. The third one is an amazing thing, because do you know much about Mervyn Peake himself?
Well, a lot more after reading up this week.
Right.
I got the feeling a bit of it, some of it I never knew, and some of it I probably looked up when I was 15,
yeah.
and then again when I was 25, and now when I was 35, yeah. And it's coming back to me, you know.
He was an amazing man. I mean, a really interesting life, and phenomenally tragic. I mean, really, really tragic life. By all accounts, a very pleasant man, very devoted to his family and his children, but suffered with numerous degenerative conditions, including Parkinson's, and also numerous psychological conditions throughout his life. And by the end of his life, he had more or less lost his mind. He did not know who he was. He was in an incredibly paranoid place. And when you read Titus Alone, which is the third book, he was writing that whilst his mind was degenerating. And it's the first time in my life where I've read, I read it when I was 21, Titus Alone, and I was in the perfect place and position to read it. A friend of mine and I, we were students, we were idiots, basically, and we'd gone to Marrakesh just on a whim. We had no money, but we decided to hop like a bus, mind you, across Europe to Marrakesh. And I caught this incredible disease while I was out there, this feverish, incredible disease. So in the sweltering heat, the Saharan heat of Marrakesh, feeling more ill than I've ever felt in my life, hallucinating in the strangest state of mind in this little back alley hotel in Marrakesh, I read Titus Alone. And it was the perfect frame of mind to read it in.
See, I would have put on Dinner Ladies. Really level me out, you know.
It was the perfect frame of mind, I've got to say. As awful as it was at the time, I wouldn't be without the experience, because Titus Alone is so unlike the other books. It is even the ethos and the setting. Like, Titus Alone takes place in the world outside of Gormenghast. So where at the end of Gormenghast, spoilers by the way, I'm going to assume that people have either watched the TV show or have read the books if they're listening to this. Titus actually leaves Gormenghast. He's essentially the Earl, which is basically the king of Gormenghast. He leaves. He rides off into the sunset, and it's done. Titus alone follows his adventures in the world outside. And the world outside of Gormenghast is so far removed from everything that occurs in the previous two stories, it may as well be occurring in a separate universe. It's often regarded by a lot of people as sort of like an alternative universe story, because it even has elements of the steampunk, of science fiction.
Yeah, aren't there planes in it and stuff?
There are planes, there are zeppelins, there are cars. There's a factory that is producing what are essentially Frankenstein workers, like genetically engineered Frankenstein workers, and Titus is thrown into all of it. It's so bizarre. It even plants the idea, the very paranoid, very sort of Philip K. Dick idea, that Gormenghast doesn't exist. A lot of the characters that Titus talks to and says, "Oh, I'm the Earl of Gormenghast," it's like, well, what the hell is that? We've never heard of this place. What are you talking about? A lot of them call him mad, and it's almost as though Peake has projected himself into the story, and you can feel the degradation of the writer's mind, of the author's mind, alongside Titus's. It's very strange.
Did you see that according to some accounts, because I know this was a thing where, Mervyn Peake's widow in the 70s and 80s was helping to sort of piece together his writings and fragments of his writings, which were literally undecipherable. Did you see that the sort of mostly theoretical fourth book, Titus Awakes, was in one draft going to have Titus eventually reach like the Channel Island of Sark and sort of become Mervyn Peake?
No! I only realised, doing background reading for this podcast, I only realised then that there was this fourth book that had been published in 2009, which his wife had sort of cobbled together from his notes and sort of embellished a little bit and finished herself, essentially. So I had no idea. But reading Titus alone, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I like the idea of this fictional character kind of pulling itself out, like spending 2 books having to escape from the fictional world and then having to travel across the fictional world and like clawing itself out of the ocean and into the author itself.
There's something bizarrely meta about that. The fourth wall, the metaphysics of that are slightly disturbing and brilliant. I love it. I actually love it, and I wish that had happened.
Yeah, it sounds good.
I wish Peake had written that. But one of the things that Titus alone also sets up is the notion that Gormenghast is not a literal place, but it's a psychological one. So it's like Alice in Wonderland, it's a psychoscape, and all of the characters in it are elements of Titus's psyche. And when you look at the characters in Gormenghast, that actually does make a certain degree of sense, because they're all so well defined. They seem to represent elements of a conflicting mind. Yeah,
definitely, I can see that. And you could even I'm assuming most people listening to this have a sort of passing familiarity with the plot, but basically the show and the first 2 books, as well as focusing on Titus Groan, the kind of Earl who's born in the first book, they also focus on the rise to power and Machiavellian intrigue of Steerpike, the boy from the kitchens. So you've got these kind of dual protagonists, and I remember even as early as an A-level essay, writing about the kind of duality of Steerpike and Titus Groan, which I think was just sort of literary common sense at that point.
Of course.
It was entry-level stuff,
Yeah, they're very much reflections of one another, aren't they? I mean, and at the same time, kind of antipodean as well. So you've got Titus, who is essentially born to privilege and hates it. He actually resents the fact that he's born to privilege. And Steerpike, who is born to abjection, and also resents the fact that he's born to abjection, but aspires to power. Now, I mean, why Steerpike aspires to power is left somewhat ambiguous. I mean, it's his intentions initially seem to be revolutionary. He does seem to want to make Gormenghast a more efficient but also more egalitarian. But I think by the end of his tenure, all of those, whatever those ideals were, have certainly fallen away.
Well, we'll praise at least most of the cast, I think, as we talk about them a bit more. But I think one thing on this rewatch, one thing that Jonathan Rhys-Myers as Steerpike gets across really well, particularly towards the end, actually, when things could easily get lost in the mix of action, is he gets across the fact that this Steerpike is deeply, deeply angry and bitter, but also kind of still scared.
Yeah.
Like really like that he didn't, part of him never left the kitchens,
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, Steerpike, and that's true in the book as well, he is, most of the time, even though it seems like it's wheels turning within wheels and that he has these incredible Machiavellian plans, he's often flying by the seat of his pants. He's taking opportunities as and when they occur and making the most of his luck.
Isn't it interesting, and this is something that just occurred to me on this rewatch, isn't it interesting that Swelter's demise has nothing directly to do with Steerpike?
Right. I mean, in most other fantasy stories, that would make poetic sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you'd have the equivalent of him, it'd be like Hansel and Gretel, you could literally do this, have him shove them into the oven,
Actually,
kind of thing.
yeah, I'm surprised that didn't occur, to be honest. I mean, to be fair, he is eaten after a sense, just not by human beings, he's eaten by the owls in the Tower of Flints. But it is a strange thing, isn't it? I mean, in fact, Swelter's death has absolutely nothing to do with Steerpike at all.
No. I mean, only in the sense that it's kind of, Flay and Swelter's memorable sword fight is carried out with the Mad Earl kind of walking through it.
I love the framing of that in the TV show, where you've got Christopher Lee and they're just trying to wield their swords around the Earl as he's kind of sleepwalking around. It's so funny.
Oh, it's amazing. It's like a W.C. Fields bit or something. It's great.
It is. I mean, that's something the TV series gets across quite well, and it is something that's implicit in the books as well. There is this wonderful commingling of the profound and the absurd, and often the tragic and the absurd as well. And I think in Sepulcrave, in the Earl of Groan, that's where that is manifested most profoundly, because he is very funny.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I was laughing out loud. The bits in the second episode of the BBC series when he's gone mad after the burning of the library, and they're trying to kind of suppress his owl-like nature long enough to have a dinner. That's like obviously it's dealing with mental illness, and tragedy
absolutely.
and stuff. But it's classic sitcom as well, isn't it?
It totally is. That sequence in particular, I love that you've got that sequence where they're all at the breakfast for Titus, and the Earl has had his first real breakdown, and they're trying to keep him sedated, essentially, literally in many respects. Prune Squaller's filling him full of all sorts of sedatives, and you're getting the interior monologues of each of the characters. It goes along and gives you the interior monologues of each of them, and the Earl of Groans is fantastic. He's sitting there hooting.
Yeah, interior hooting would be the subtitle.
Yeah, and in fact, I think it's also really sad. It's really disturbing because Fuchsia, of course, has just started to realise some kind of relationship with her father, and it's all been taken away from her. I mean, I love Fuchsia. Is probably one of my favourite characters in the entire book because there is a kind of innocence to her. She's been so sheltered from pretty much everything. She's never had any experience to turn her into a woman, to make her into the woman she is, and that doesn't really start to happen until these tragedies and traumas start to befall her.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I was thinking I mean, what? I'm trying to work out a way in which we could go through and talk about the actors in the BBC adaptation without it just being 10 minutes on each one where we just talk about how marvellous they all are.
Yeah, that's the problem. Isn't it? Because they are really, really good. I mean, there's some odd casting choices in certain ways, but I understand why it was made. Like June Brown, who plays Nanny Slag. She's brilliant. She is absolutely wonderful in that role. I mean, the only thing, and this is a purist thing, Nanny Slag in the book is tiny,
right?
So tiny that Steerpike can pick her up like a doll, and he does. In one of his crueler moments, he picks her up and seats her on this plinth, and it's too high for her. Her legs are sort of dangling over the edge, which you can't really get across in the BBC adaptation because June Brown's actually quite a tall woman, but she's wonderful.
Yeah, well, and they frame everything, don't they? Not quite to filming Gandalf and the Hobbits in Lord of the Rings levels, but they make these characters appear imposing or tiny as needed, don't they? Quite artfully,
as required. Yeah,
it's a wonderfully directed thing in general. We should credit the director, by the way, Andy Wilson, who's probably has obviously done loads of good work, but is probably more obscure than he deserves to be based on this. So if I can possibly get Andy Wilson to listen to this podcast, I will, because we appreciate his work.
Well, quite frankly, anyone who is involved with this project, and anyone who willfully got involved with this project, because they've always said that the Lord of the Rings, it was always the old saw once upon a time that the Lord of the Rings was the classic unfilmable text. That was like a saw in cinema and television. It wasn't really true. The Lord of the Rings as a story is actually very filmable. It was just waiting for technology to catch up to it. Gormenghast, as written, is unfilmable. It's totally unfilmable because it is the book is so much about the interiority of the characters as much as it is about the exteriority of Gormenghast itself. There's this whole interplay that occurs between the characters and Gormenghast itself, where Gormenghast is like an expression of who they are. The moods of Gormenghast shift and change as the moods of the characters shift and change. And as the power dynamics alter, as the culture is altered by Steerpike's interference, by Titus's abdication of his role as Earl and all of that kind of thing, it's such a difficult thing to do. I do not envy anyone who comes to adapting this text.
Well, this particular adaptation as well, coming at the moment it did, we talked a bit about sort of the position of fantasy media at that point, which was nascent by our standards today. Yeah. One thing that it's a really weird accident of my rewatching over lockdown, but I rewatched for the first time in probably like a decade and a half, just the other week, The Phantom Menace.
Right.
And I was realizing, in the exterior scenes in this, when this is the thing, is that there aren't really any exterior scenes in this because no one leaves Gormenghast until the very end. But anything that's kind of set outside with green screen or whatever technology they use to get all these fantastic vistas in and backdrops, it sort of made me think that it's a bit fatuous, but like Gormenghast is kind of the Phantom Menace if it worked. Like it's, you know what I mean, the aesthetics of it, but also kind of the well-directed actors and the better actors in general.
Yeah, I get what you mean. It's just visualizing Gormenghast is a nightmare. It's a total nightmare because the book is very explicit on what Gormenghast is supposed to be like. So the castle of Gormenghast, it's a city-state essentially, isn't it? It's a giant walled city-state that is just layer upon layer, story upon story, tower upon tower of ancient dungeons and bastions and kitchens and floors that have never been accessed for like generations, that have just been left to spiders and beetles, that are filled with old works of art. It's so difficult to realise. But I think the BBC adaptation does a really good job. If I had a criticism, and it's a very nitpicky thing, the book takes a great deal of time to explain how the interior of Gormenghast is almost perpetually murky and dark and very grey. It's all stone. The interior of Gormenghast is the stones, and they are grey. Whereas the BBC adaptation is actually kind of quite colourful.
It makes it look quite nice, a lot of it, doesn't it?
Kind of does. There's a lot of they've gone really hard for like different textured stones in different areas to give them a different ethos and a different sense of feeling. So early on in the BBC adaptation, you get to go down to the kitchens to see Swelter and the kitchen boys, and it's like Dante's Inferno. It's red and it's blistering and it's hot. It's full of steam. Then you go up to the Tower of Flints, and that is completely different. The little rooms that the teachers occupy, completely different from everywhere else. Prune Squaller's quarters, again, completely different. Fuchsia's quarters, different from everywhere else. Everything has its own sense of architecture, its own interior design, and it's really clever. It's actually really clever and very, very beautiful.
I think they do get a fair bit of that into the show. I mean, it actually, I was going to mention video games in a different context, but it makes it feel as much like, say, Princess Peach's castle as like any kind of real castle, doesn't it?
Absolutely. There's something about Gormenghast that is slightly video game environment in an odd way, especially when you've got Steerpike climbing all over it.
Well, I was thinking in terms of the aesthetic of it, especially me coming into it from a sort of late 90s kid perspective. I think I was probably thinking of things like, like Mist and Riven.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
That kind of painted, almost like painted fluid FMV backdrop kind of fantastical vista, that you couldn't yet do in interactive graphics so much,
Well, I suppose it's one of the ways in which Gormenghast is slightly more classically fantastical. It's one of the more fantastical elements of the book. The fact of the kingdom itself, the silhouette of it, when you see it, the entirety of it is like a fantastical kingdom. It's a bit like the castles that you'll see off in the distance in an Elder Scrolls game, like in Skyrim or something to that effect. But that's really as far as it goes when it comes to fantastical elements. People who like their fantasy shouldn't come to this expecting magic or monsters or demons or gods, or you won't get any of that because it's not here.
It's funny, in terms of what people should come to it for, I was thinking about, because I recorded an episode of this podcast with Kit Power just before the new year, and we were talking primarily about House of Cards, so thus Ian Richardson, which I'm going to sing his praises or hoot his praises a little bit more before we're done. But one thing it also reminded me of is me and Kit warmed up a little bit by talking about The Crown, which we both just finished watching. And what made me think of that, and why fans of The Crown might get a kick out of this series of Gormenghast is I was watching. I don't know if you saw, if your like copy of Gormenghast, George has the sort of like short making of featurette that they did. It's like a half-hour thing.
It does. I used to have the. I don't think I've still got them, unfortunately, but I had the double VHS set that the BBC put out, and yes, towards the end there's the making of featurette, which is extensive and brilliant.
Yeah, it's good. It's I mean, they talk a little bit about the production and the sketches they did for it and the values, but they also have pretty much all the actors, I think, on most of them weigh in a little bit. And the bit that made me laugh the most was in terms of watching The Crown recently was John Sessions, R.I.P. was there talking. He's in garb as Prune Squalor, and he's talking about. I think he's talking about Clarice and Cora, and he describes their character, and their kind of doll-like zombie kind of duality there. Yes. And then he just casually says to camera, he's like, you can't help but think of Princess Margaret.
I think I remember that. Yes. And
and it just cuts to the next feature. I'm just like, yeah, that's great.
All the characters in the BBC adaptation are charming. The actors just go for it. They get them. They get these characters in such a profound way. But the one that I just adore whenever he's on screen is Prune Squalor.
He's amazing, isn't he? He's amazing. I actually spent a bit because there was tons of stuff I didn't know about John Sessions as a man, as an actor, and I was actually reading up a fair bit today because I was kind of like, oh yeah, I vaguely remember him being involved with Whose Line Is It Anyway? And and I was like, had a lot going on, like a lot of different things.
Yeah, he had an extensive career and phenomenally intelligent. If you ever see him interviewed about things, phenomenally considered, aware of things like politics and culture and history. Massively so, but he inhabits Prune Squalor. He is the character. It's one of those bizarre moments of televisual alchemy where the actor is the character. There's just no division between them at all. He captures the voice of Prune Squalor in such a perfect way that there's no way anyone else could ever play that character in my mind.
Such a complicated character as well, isn't he? Because he's kind of, many people have said, but Dr. Prune Squalor is foolish and clever and pathetic and brave and lecherous and noble and and all, and not even to get into his more than ambiguous sexuality and stuff like
his more than ambiguous sexuality. Yeah, well, this is a hallmark of Gormenghast itself. Actually, the characters initially appear as fantasy archetypes and then reveal themselves to be not. So when Prune Squalor first appears, you'd be forgiven for thinking that he's just comic relief. And that's true in the book as it is in the TV series. Because, of course, in the TV series, he is essentially baiting Gertrude while she's giving birth. She's trying desperately to get him to tell her what the sex of the child is. Because, of course, if it's a boy, it's a new grown. That's wonderful. But he's extending the moment. He's drawing it out as much as he possibly can, as he does. He's verbose. He's a verbose character.
Putting him up against Gertrude at the very start as well is a fun way to get you into not just the plot, but into kind of maybe two of the more different characters that you're going to meet.
Yeah, the dynamic between them is fascinating because, of course, he irritates her. Gertrude is all practicality, and in fact, I think the core of their relationship comes later when she says to him, "Why do you use so many words when only one will do?" That's essentially it. That is the core of Prune Squalor and of Gertrude.
Well, Gertrude's fascinating, isn't she? Because she's, I was talking before about the White Witch being like Boudica-like and stuff like. I think if, I'm a staunch anti-monarchical Republican, but I think if the Queen looked more like Celia Imrie in this, I think I'd probably become a monarchist.
Yeah. If she acted,
kind of awe-inspiring, isn't she?
If she acted more like Gertrude, then I'd be well in.
Oh, Gertrude for PM, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, like, the way she deals with the flood towards the end of the show. But it's. But I was just thinking, she's kind of she's interesting, isn't she? Because like she's a very, very clever character, like brutally clever, but not imaginative at all.
Not imaginative, and also strangely flighty. So she has these incredible eccentricities, like her fascination with her birds and cats, for example.
Yeah.
And also, like so many of the characters, you have to really get into the culture and the mindset of Gormenghast to understand why she doesn't see what's happening. They all have intimations. Prune Squalor has intimations of what's happening. They all feel it because there is it's essentially a disturbance in the Force. The traditions of Gormenghast are in peril. Something has upset the great engine of Gormenghast. But because it's so unthinkable to them, this sort of thing hasn't happened before. It doesn't happen. The notion of rebellion, of someone not conceding to their born place and status, to their function, is unthinkable. It's a null concept.
Do you have a goat?
A goat, ladyship.
Milk for the cats?
Ah! See what you mean, a goat. Have I got a goat?
That's better.
Bring my goat.
Your goat?
The goat man. Bring it.
We haven't got a goat.
I require service, not sophistry. Get my goat! I'm amazed, ladyship. Where are the traditions of service?
How old are you?
38, madam.
Sit down.
Ladyship.
How long since we've seen each other?
5 years, madam.
I've been thinking. Since the burning of the library and the disappearance of my husband, things have been wrong. For years, something uneasy. Do you feel it, Squalor? And now Clarice and Cora. Bodies not found, not buried.
Their note mentioned burning, ladyship. Perhaps it was they who...
Burn the library? A groan? Burn a groan? Never. Made me think of it all again. There is something among us. There is stench. I can smell it.
Do you mean rebellion, ladyship?
Rebellion? Who would dare rebel against Gormenghast?
Forgive me, madam.
I want you to watch. Watch for me, do you hear? If there is such a thing as rebellion, we shall find it. Do you understand me, Squalor?
I have no doubt, ladyship.
Oh, wait. I found one, Doctor.
Wrong sex, you idiot.
You bring the female goat, you fool.
Yeah, female goat.
Take it away.
Ah!
I have a faith in you, Squalor. I don't know why.
I'm honored, madam.
Mark my words, if this thing exists, it shall be crushed.
I think that's such a good point because I was thinking, trying to be more critical of the show. I was watching it the other night and I was thinking, I think you're getting into episode 3 and even early episode 4, and you're there trying to find out, Prune Squalor and Gertrude and Flay and stuff are trying to work out what's going on. I think Flay twigs earlier than most
Flay
people.
kind of twigs,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting as well because he's not the brightest tool in the box.
No, he isn't.
You could probably analyse that a bit as well, why he's the one, but apart from just events, But I think you make a good point there because I was thinking that people might have little patience with this adaptation if they think it's meant to be a sort of whodunit, or even not a whodunit, but if you're meant to give the other characters credit for not seeing Steerpike coming. But I think you have to appreciate on that metaphorical level, don't you? Not to be pretentious, but you have to think about what Steerpike represents and not just the character he appears to be, because obviously. The easy answer would be, well, maybe it's the guy who's acting really sinisterly to everyone, and the only guy who you didn't know beforehand.
The only guy who's been connected to everyone who's died. Everyone who's died. Yeah, it does. It just doesn't work on that level, does it? It is not that. The story just isn't that literal. You're not supposed to take it that literally. But also, when you put yourself into the culture of Gormenghast and you understand that. The very notion that like an individual could be acting against Gormenghast or against the traditions of Gormenghast it's beyond blasphemy in this culture. It's actually anathema. They can't even conceive of it. Prune Squalor notices. Prune Squalor has this very vague intimation in his mind that something isn't right and that Steerpike is part of it, but he can't quite. Even though Prune Squalor is one of the cleverest characters in the entire thing, he can't quite get a grasp on it until he sees it.
But is that why it's fun to contrast him with Titus? And I think, probably Peake means you to contrast him with Titus in the sense that, simplifying a bit here, but Titus hates Gormenghast, whereas Steerpike merely hates everyone in it, which is less of a problem.
It's less... it kind of is. The funny thing... I was thinking about this before we came on, but imagine if Steerpike had won and that he'd ascended to the throne of Gormenghast with Fuchsia at his side. All that would have really happened is you would have gotten a new version of Gormenghast. Gormenghast wouldn't have collapsed. It would have just been reorganised. So you would have just had a kind of rejuvenation. Titus is the footstep of doom for Gormenghast, because he is the ruler who abdicates, and there isn't anyone else to do it. One could even have certain readings of Titus alone, where Titus leaves Gormenghast behind, that Gormenghast actually just winks out of existence when he's gone.
That's very much how I feel about it. That's how it comes across. Or maybe it goes into a sort of stasis, like a sort of the thorns grow up across it.
Yeah.
And, Gertrude is just left there sleeping.
So it sort of fossilizes, because it's something that Barkentine points out. Barkentine is the keeper of the law of Gormenghast, essentially. He's the secretary, so his role within Gormenghast is to maintain all of the traditions. He is the one...
As played by the great Warren Mitchell. In this.
Brilliantly played. In fact, in the BBC adaptation, he's a sort of portmanteau of two characters. He's Sourdust, who is the original secretary, and Barkentine, who is his son. Sourdust actually dies in the burning of the library and appoints his son as secretary. I mean, that gives you a good example of how more extended the timeline of the book is, because Barkentine is old by the time he ascends to the role of secretary, and then has time basically to watch Steerpike age and grow up, But he is the keeper of the law of Gormenghast, and it's his business to maintain all of the traditions. But he basically says, and it's actually a line that is in the BBC adaptation, what is the point of Gormenghast without the Earl? When Titus goes off on one of his flights where he actually escapes and runs off, he basically stops everything. He stands in front of Gertrude and says, "No, with greatest respect, mistress, what is the point of Gormenghast without the Earl there?"
Yeah, it's the one time anyone overrules Gertrude, and she seems to get the point of it. It's kind of because he's kind of right. I mean, and that's. Do you remember that's because they're also looking for Swelter, but that's what he points out. Like, without the Earl, who needs a chef? Like ignoring the fact. Well, look, deliberately overlooking the fact that there are thousands of other people on the ground.
Yeah, but who cares about them, mate?
Yeah, but you get the feeling in a sense Barkentine wouldn't need to eat either. There's kind of it's not like he's enjoying that privilege. He doesn't have anything to do either without that kind of cog that's gone.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? All of these characters like Flay, like Barkentine, are consumed by Gormenghast. They're born to it. They're functionaries of it, and they can't conceive or imagine of a life or an existence, an identity outside of it. So when Titus is gone, and Titus runs away quite a lot, he basically scarpers quite a lot, their entire being is over. It's in stasis until he comes back. It's why the punishments for his abdication are so severe. I mean, even Flay says to him at one point, he confesses to Mr. Flay after Flay's exile from the castle. He confesses that he hates Gormenghast, and Flay just doesn't accept it. He just says, "No, it can't be." It's
he's like, "No, lordship, no." Almost like he's made a maths mistake or something.
Like
he wants to see his working. How he could have arrived at that point of view.
It's an error. It's just untrue. It can't be. Unfortunately, it is. It is true. So in Titus, you have the end of Gormenghast. Doesn't matter what happens. They can stop Steerpike, and they do. They do stop Steerpike. Doesn't matter. Gormenghast is finished.
Do you think there's obviously these are books you love, and your politics, I know, are not conservative.
No, they're very not.
Do you think there's a certain, not criticism necessarily, but do you think there's a certain interpretation to make that Gormenghast is despite its revulsion, a lot of ritual and conservatism has elements of conservatism in it because it has a character like Steerpike in it.
I think so. I think that the thing with Gormenghast is that it is a sincere metaphorical examination of societal systems. It's not even... Politics is part of that, but it's talking about the phenomena of society itself and what it does to human beings. And it looks at that in all of its ambiguity. So you have characters who are appalled and frightened by what Steerpike represents, and what Steerpike represents is rebellion, revolution, change, often in a very destructive, murderous way. But Steerpike himself is ambiguous. He is the revolutionary. There is almost a sense that he could be a footstep of hope for Gormenghast, and he could have been, were it not for the fact that he's so abused, he's so broken, he's so tormented, and of course he also goes through extended traumas on top of that. He gets burnt very, very badly towards the end, and that event seems to be a cipher for him, doesn't it? That seems to be the event that really tips him over the edge into complete murderous, almost nihilistic mania. You get the impression that after that he doesn't really care about reforming Gormenghast. He would see it destroyed. He would see it toppled from the top down.
What is that bit that I know in the show he says it to Fuchsia, and I think in maybe episode 3 where he's talking about equality being everything. But is it? I'm sure I read that in the book he's doing that while pulling the legs off a beetle.
Yeah, there's a great ambiguity. Steerpike talks a good game. He knows what to say to people to get them on side. So you never know whether what he's saying is sincere or not. In fact, one of the great things about the book is his intentions are always fairly oblique. So you may believe what he's saying. He may believe in equality and egalitarianism, and his argument is really succinct. It's really succinct, and it makes perfect sense. He just says, don't you think it's wrong that some people have nothing and others have so much that they waste it? Don't you think that talent is as important as wealth? Yeah, absolutely. It's a great argument. Does he put that into practice? Well, not necessarily, because he does end up murdering a lot of the, the downstairs people from which he was born. Nanny Slag being probably the most obvious. Although I will say, in the book, whether he actually does murder Nanny Slag is really ambiguous. In the BBC adaptation, it's not. He definitely poisons her, because he has access.
He talks about how he's going to do it.
Well,
he does it, right?
You've got a shot of him in the doctor's dispensary where he actually takes Nanny's medicine, and I think he says something like, "Poor Nanny, you're the easiest, so you can go first." So yeah, I think in the book it's implied, but only because he's present in the doctor's offices at that time. There's nothing overt, so he may not do that. She may just die of old age.
One thing that watching it this time, I was thinking, I was looking at the politics of it a bit as we went along, and kind of as everything from the point where he leaves the kitchen, everything he says to a member of the Grown family. Basically, I was trying to analyse as best I could as we whizzed along. But I was thinking one way in which he stands quite well for kind of the rise of actual fascism and fascist-like movements is the way he's got this knack for targeting and using the weak links in the ruling class. Like the kind of the weak links in the aristocracy, like Clarissa and Cora, the obvious example there.
And Fuchsia, obviously. I mean, Fuchsia's a very good example. I mean, she is his biggest mistake is underestimating her.
Yeah, well, this is so interesting because to mention Clarissa and Cora and Fuchsia would not seem to have much in common on the surface, but Steerpike for them is someone who can grant their wishes, right?
Yeah,
and even the wishes that they can't really fully articulate. Often it takes him to articulate them or semi-articulate them.
And he's perfect at that. I mean, he has the psychopath's knack of reading people immediately and knowing what to say, knowing exactly what buttons to press, how to charm them, how to inveigle them, and he uses it all the way through. I think one of the things you have to do with Steerpike is whenever he is talking or interacting with anyone, assume he is insincere. Even when he seems to be vouchsafing a philosophy or something to that, like he does in his conversations with Fuchsia, I think what he's doing there actually is planting the seeds for a longer term game. So he sees Fuchsia as his means of establishing a more legitimate rule. So if he just went and killed all of the Groans, which I have no doubt he would do if he wanted to, if he did that, then he would always be an illegitimate ruler, wouldn't he? He wouldn't be able to get the people of Gormenghast on side. Whereas if he toppled them all except for Fuchsia and ended up marrying her, it would be slightly different.
Well, even his sadism and his cruelty sometimes seems insincere because, you know, the somewhat ridiculous scene where he taunts Flay with that wonderful sort of flailing throat voice thing that he does, and then gets Flay to throw a cat at him. I mean, you then, from the timing of Gertrude coming in and then banishing Flay, you kind of can put together that Steerpike probably knew she'd be walking into the room in the next 60 seconds, you know, so it's kind of, much as he might dislike Flay or find him ridiculous, you know, you get he doesn't care enough, you know, maybe to do that if he wasn't trying to achieve something like that, you know.
No, that's absolutely true. Although later on, he does. I think he ultimately what does for Steerpike is what often does for these kinds of characters. It's ego. You know, he takes far too much time gloating and tormenting his victims, and that ultimately ends up being his undoing. Like, for example, Barkentine. If he just killed the man when he had the chance, he would have been fine. He probably would have won. But he doesn't. He torments him, he tortures him, and ultimately Barkentine ends up inflicting a really severe wound.
Yeah, well, you know, I was talking about gonzo elements of this. I'd forgotten how insane his death scene is.
It's mad. I mean, Barkentine goes through the ringer. He's an old guy anyway, and he knows that he's sickly and he's dying. That's why he's writing the letter to his son, you know, so he can succeed him. Steerpike ends up slicing his neck open. He throws a knife through his hand. He ends up burning him. Eventually, Barkentine carries him down into the waters, of course, and still clings to him after he's in the water.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Because Barkendine's such a horrible character. But
he's vile.
You know, when Steerpike's kind of mocking him and like mock kissing him on the head before he kills him and stuff, you know, it's kind of like you feel sorry for him.
Oh, definitely, yeah, absolutely, you do. I feel sorry for most of Steerpike's victims, I've got to say. I mean, Clarice and Cora are kind of the classic ones. They are. It's their lack of intelligence, I think, that makes them so sympathetic. It's the fact that there is this slightly childlike quality to them. Which is, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're not innocent by any stretch of the imagination. They want power, they want to rule. They would be the worst rulers of anything on Earth.
Yes. Yeah, they're not Gertrude, are they?
They're definitely not
Gertrude.
Gertrude.
Their hatred for Gertrude seems to sort of reveal that under the surface.
I think that's probably where it comes from. I think it's the fact that, you know, in the book, there is a heavy implication that Gertrude comes from the very lower classes. She married into the Groan name, and she's not from the Carvers, she's not that low, but she's not that high either. But ironically, she is the most legitimate person in that role in terms of her competence. I mean, that's another mistake Steerpike makes. He underestimates Gertrude. Everybody underestimates Gertrude, actually.
Well, even at the end, you know, when he's got that catapult that he's just. I think he kills about 15 people in the last episode. You know, of that, you know, just guards and. Yeah. But you know, when Gertrude's like looking down at him and she actually dodges his catapult bullet, so she's pretty formidable to the end, isn't she?
Oh, Gertrude is fantastic. I mean, you know, I say that. Gormenghast probably falls apart without Titus, but to be fair, with Gertrude in charge, who knows? Who knows? She's certainly a more legitimate ruler than Titus is. I mean, one of the things that the series captures really well is that slightly whiny egocentrism of Titus.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah.
You know, he's kind of an impotent character for the longest time. It's his contrariness to Steerpike. Steerpike is in no way self-pitying. He's not self-pitying, and he's active the whole time. Everything he does is exterior. He is trying to affect the world around him. Titus is the exact opposite. He's wimpish, he's foppish, and he is interior all the time, and he's mopey and totally self-pitying.
Yeah, and scared of Steerpike as well, you know.
Oh, I'm totally scared of Steerpike, but then that's probably good instinct.
Yeah, no, it totally is on a sort of evolutionary level. Well, I mean, I suppose it's because Titus, and we'll get back to the privilege inherent in this, because I suppose it's because Titus gets to be a teenager or something approaching one, doesn't it? Whereas Steerpike didn't have that luxury.
Absolutely.
I really like that line. Is it? I think it's when he's killed Steerpike near the climax, when Titus has jumped out the window and skewered him. But it's either then or just before then when Titus is talking to Gertrude and he says like, he should have been Steerpike should have been your son, mother. at least he would have appreciated it.
Yeah.
You know? It's like he everything he wants, as you say, you know, is Gormenghast essentially as it is, you know.
Yeah, it's
and that's
true.
The one thing he couldn't have.
It's absolutely true. I mean, there's a line earlier on that kind of complements that beautifully, where Steerpike is talking to Fuchsia, and he says of Titus, "Your brother is so weak that he can't even appreciate, he can't take what's given to him." And yeah, that's absolutely true. Titus, if he had the gumption and the intelligence that Steerpike does, could change Gormenghast. If he doesn't like it, he could change it. He's the Earl. He has that power. If he just overrode Barkentine and overrode his mother, he could do it. That's what Steerpike would do. But he just doesn't. He moans about it. He's kind of very British in that regard. He's a very British character, isn't he? He moans about it, and he sort of throws his little temper tantrums, but he doesn't actually do anything until the end. Until the very end. And the only reason he does that is selfish. It's because Fuchsia has died, and he blames Steerpike, and he wants a bit of revenge.
Yeah, and then he goes on his gap year.
He goes off on his gap year, yeah. I also love the last line of Steerpike. I don't think it's the last line that he has in the book, but in the BBC adaptation, after Titus has slid down the ivy and has skewered him, Steerpike leans in and coughs through the blood, "You were lucky." And that's a line that works on multiple different levels. He's saying you got lucky with the strike, for one thing, because if it was a fair fight, if Steerpike wasn't half starved from not having eaten and wasn't like
half underwater,
you know, he would have murdered Titus. He would have absolutely murdered him. But Titus gets a lucky strike and ends up killing him. But it's also the fact that Titus was lucky because of where he was born and because of his status, whereas Steerpike wasn't, you know?
Oh, definitely, yeah. No, I really appreciate that moment this time around. I wanted to highlight two scenes that really struck me this time round. Actually, both have Niamh McIntosh as a Fuchsia in them. One was one I was looking forward to, and one was one that I'd kind of forgotten about and really loved this time round. So the first one's in episode 2 when Sepulchrave is mad, and you get that scene that I remembered quite well actually, where it's a fairly long scene, like about 5 minutes long, where him and Fuchsia are hanging out, and she's helping him sort of sketch out his new library in the soil like it's an allotment. You know, and he gets to do Ian Richardson again. You know, let's just praise to the skies. You know, but like he gets to do the full Lear there, but basically, doesn't he? He gets to do the whole thing and go through several stages of madness and terror and self-pity, and then that kind of, you know, he ends the scene on that, you know, having become the death owl kind
and
of
that
thing.
terrible absence that he captures, you know, which is so redolent of those conditions, of things like dementia and of certain forms of Alzheimer's. You know, he captures it. He has. It's clear to me watching Richardson's performance that he has known people with certain forms of Alzheimer's, because he goes for it. You can see the absence in his eyes. You can see that emptiness that comes over him.
One by one. We shall stock another 3 tonight. This is where the poets will be. The philosophers over there, I think, Takes much thought to build a library. How many have we done so far?
7 shelves, Father.
Then 3 more, child, 3 more.
Yes, Father.
That's it. Now we have space for the Sonian poets. Have you the books ready?
I've collected them here.
Who are you?
I'm your daughter.
I have a son. I know that. He is Titus. He will be Earl of Gormenghast when I'm dead.
He is my brother.
And so you are my daughter, are you? What's your name?
Fuchsia.
Fuchsia. I don't think I know Fuchsia. Do I?
Do I know you, Fuchsia?
I suppose we don't know each other that well, but I should very much like to know you better.
Would you? Yes, I see. The books, then, Fuchsia.
Here are the poets you asked for. Shall I start putting them on the first long shelf for you?
The poets. Ah, yes, the poets. We should never have had the poets.
They tell us, you see. Their pen is the pulse, Fuchsia. Their voice is the bell. Their words travel down and down and on and on into nothing and on into such nothing and nothing and nothing.
Father, the books? No. Father, please! I can't bear it! Please.
I think you've made a mistake.
You are not my daughter. How could you be? Come here and I'll tell you. Come. I am not your father. You see, I live up there. You see, I am the death owl.
And it's so devastating at that point because Fuchsia's never really had a relationship with her father. That's not really something that happens amongst the groans of Gormenghast, especially for the girl children. They're obviously largely discarded. I mean, you only have to look at the sisters for that, Clarice and Cora. And that's basically what's happened to Fuchsia. She's been chucked aside in favour of the male child, the Earl, But at this point, they do start to build a relationship, and it's hideously ironic because it's at the point where she's ultimately going to lose him anyway.
And perhaps already has, in a sense.
Yeah, it's really sad. Anything involving Sepulchrave is incredibly sad. Although, his ending is oddly exultant, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, kind of, in a sense that he's become this different thing that wants different things.
Yeah, Flea even says it at one point when he's telling Fuchsia the story much later on. He says it's what he wanted, ladyship. It's what he wanted.
Which is true at the end, isn't it?
Yeah, it is actually true. I mean, poor old Flea. I love we've already spoken about the sequence where him and Ian Richardson are having a sword fight around. It's so much fun. It's so much fun. But where he doesn't realise what his lordship wants, he's just obeying. Because that's his function. That's what he does,
Well, one of the amazing images and one that I laughed out loud at in the adaptation was, when they've agreed to, it was Swelter's dead, and they've, he hints that they're going to give him to the owls.
Yeah.
It just cuts to the very elderly pair of Ian Richardson and Christopher Lee carrying Richard Griffiths up the stairs.
Yes.
And I think in the book they make it much clearer that took a long time.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, in the book it's tortuous because the expanse of Gormenghast. It's not really made for old people. There's not much in the way of accessibility in Gormenghast. So dragging the enormity of Swelter up to the Tower of Flints is not good.
Talk about unflattering roles for actors as well that are lent into. I mean, Richard Griffiths in this is remarkable, isn't he?
Oh, again, Swelter. I mean, he occurs very early on in the book, and the sequence in the kitchen when he first turns up is much extended in the book. He has essentially in the book a whole song and dance routine because everybody's celebrating because of the birth of the new grown. So all of the kitchen boys, all of the kitchen staff are largely drunk, and Swelter is the drunkest of the drunk. And he stood on a big table, and he's basically regaling them with his wonderfully poetic mode of speech. I love the way Swelter talks, which is something that Richard Griffiths just captures just so beautifully,
Yeah, no, and you get little bits of whimsy in there as well. I mean, dark whimsy, because it's horrible, but
because he's vile, he's a repulsive character
with the little snaggletooth that he's got. I mean, the bit that stuck in my head from watching it at the age 14 was the bit where he's showing. Is it Flay he's showing the kitchen boys to? And
that's right.
And he describes them as his ickle spickle boys really salaciously, and then just goes, yes.
Yeah, that's actually in the book as well. I mean, it never overtly states that there is some kind of abusive thing going on here, barring just the violently abusive. But the way he talks about and to them, there is something really hideously familiar about it. It's very unpleasant. He has nicknames for all of them. He calls them my flowers of flatulence, he calls Steerpike the most beautiful thing, and it's the most perfect encapsulation of who Steerpike is, and it's amazing that Swelter says it. He calls him my ray of addled sunshine.
That's a very good description. I mean, as Jonathan Rhys-Meyers is, an age-appropriate Steerpike in this adaptation, are we allowed ourselves to be a little bit salacious about him?
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be in the book. Because, actually, that's a weird thing. I mean, a lot of people who like the books were kind of critical of this, because in the book, Steerpike's kind of ugly. He's not an attractive person. I mean, have you seen Mervyn Peake's infamous sketch of Steerpike?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
He does look like Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. I can see why they got him to play him, but Jonathan Rhys-Meyers is much more handsome than Steerpike is.
Well, and has topless scenes in this and stuff, where a lot of the cast are joining you in ogling him.
Actually, yeah, Irma Prune Squalor, absolutely. Oh my God, I will happily fast forward through the whole thing and just watch the scenes with Irma.
Oh my God, Fiona Shaw is you could sort of, and they almost do this with episode 3, don't they? They have inappropriately dark stuff happening in the background, but they kind of stop the whole series for episode 3 to be this farce where Fiona Shaw takes centre stage.
I love it to bits. It is so funny. The teachers, the cast they get to play the teachers, which are all comedy actors of the era. So you've got
fucking Spike Milligan,
Steve Pemberton from the League of Gentlemen. Richard Dreyfuss is one of them, I believe.
James Dreyfuss.
James Dreyfuss, not Richard Dreyfuss. Yeah. Stephen Fry, of course.
You've got Phil Cornwell from Stella Street, who worked with Sessions, hadn't you?
Right. It's amazing. It's an amazing cast. And, most of these characters are not that significant. They've got a few lines at most, and that's it. Barring Belgrove, of course, who is front and centre. Beautifully played by Stephen Fry, I've got to say. Absolutely beautifully played. I love the awkwardness of that romance.
Yeah, it's a nice little bit of Stephen Fry, isn't it? And it's also not an overuse of Stephen Fry because they kind of keep him largely confined to that episode.
Yeah, I also love the fact that he has a part to play with regards to Titus. Why did I call him Typhus?
That's a good MSN name.
Was that a Freudian slip going on? That's so weird. But he has a part to play with regards to Titus because he is one of his paternal characters, isn't he? He's one of the guiding forces. What I love about Belgrove is he's so powerfully impotent. He doesn't really know what he's doing in any which way, but has this bluster about him, this pomposity, which all the other teachers know. They all see, because they don't really take themselves that seriously. Even in the book, they don't take themselves that seriously. But Belgrove has this presence about him, with his big leonine head and his hair stuck out all over the place. He takes his role and his purpose incredibly seriously. Nobody else does. Nobody else cares.
Yeah, but he's also just a big, ridiculous, lonely man.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. I mean,
that lovely scene he has when he's talking to himself in the mirror.
Yo, I love the loneliness of Belgrove and of Irma, actually. There is a certain loneliness to both of them. With Irma, I get the impression it's much more aesthetic. It's because she wants a husband on the arm, doesn't she? You know, she wants to appear in public places with her leonine statuesque husband on her arm. But Belgrove is genuinely lonely. Genuinely lonely. And it's a portrait of what Gormenghast does to people. I mean, certain characters don't care. Characters like Barkentine, like Flay, they don't care about their loneliness. They actually don't get lonely because it wouldn't occur to them to be lonely. But characters like Belgrove, who are given very specific functions that don't incorporate the building of relationships and haven't taught them how to do it. Irma has no idea what relationships are. Her notion of relationships come from romance novels and romance paintings and are entirely false.
And it's these kind of small flashes of what you might call the middle classes of Gormenghast that you see that the higher level of contempt that they are held in by the Groans as well. Like, the Groans don't give a crap about Irma. The Groans, Belgrove thinks of himself when he ascends to headmaster as a pillar of the community, and is just then bulldozed by Barkentine. The moment he tries to have any input into anything.
The moment Barkentine turns up, and later on Steerpike when he becomes secretary, of course, and in fact Titus shows him absolutely no respect whatsoever. He's got no authority at all outside of his own head.
That's true. Actually, the thing, in the scene where all the teachers are first sort of revealed and they're all talking in the staff room together and bickering, the thing it really reminded me of was the Wizards of Unseen University.
Totally. I have no doubt, because I know for a fact Pratchett was a big fan of Gormenghast. I have no doubt. Well, Unseen University itself has elements of Gormenghast about it, doesn't it, in terms of its structure and the way it functions. Yeah, I mean, I imagine that's what he had in mind when he first conceptualized the Wizards of Unseen University. I've no doubt.
Stop playing with your teeth, Belgrove. It's damn rude.
I'm in pain, Mr. Perch. And what the hell have my teeth got to do with you?
You're a hoarder, you damn pedant. Get them extracted.
Oh, poor old Fangs.
Fangs? Is that how you consider me, Fluke? Canine? I'll remind you that 15 short years ago, I was considered for headmaster. Yes, Fluke, headmaster.
Oh, pain doesn't exist, dear boy. It is merely an expression of inner disturbance. The fact that you imagine it to be in your teeth is interesting. Have you said something you regret lately?
Ow! Pain doesn't exist, dear boy. Perhaps we've put our foot in it lately, have we?
Death! I can hear it squeak. Here it comes.
My wife for death! My wife for death! Yes, man, yes, he has a name. Show some respect.
It's the headmaster. Get out of it. He's got something to say. I notice for you all.
Who are all these people?
It's your staff, headmaster.
Oh.
Shall I get Belgrove to read the edict?
Why not?
What an honor, headmaster. Thank you. Edict.
Read it, hurry up. Some Barkentine.
Get your teeth into it, Belgrove.
Yes, can he understand more than 7 words in a row?
Silence! Professor Belgrove.
Reference Lord Titus, 77th Earl. I, being Secretary Barkentine, give notice to remind you that no privileges of caste, class, or title shall be afforded the aforesaid lord, according to the ironclad precedents of Gormenghast. He shall be of the ordinary, no more, no less, until his time of reason and puberty. Take note, you exist to teach, not fawn. Fawn?
Barkentine, you bastard bugger!
Headmaster Diath, I would have you impress upon your staff the magnitude of their office, and in particular those who confuse their calling with indolence. Signed, as for Barkentine, Steerpike. Steerpike?
It's you, Belgrove. The whole damn thing's aimed at you.
Oh, dear!
Ah! But you teach his lordship, don't you?
Who did you say all these people were?
Nothing you need be concerned with, Headmaster. Out!
No!
Out! Get out!
Steerpike, you bastard bugger!
I said I was going to talk about two scenes. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this other scene that comes this one time in episode 4. I didn't remember this scene at all, but it really struck me on this time to the extent that I actually rewound it and watched it again. And it's the one where things are fairly well advanced with the flood and Steerpike's on the run, and it's his final scene with Fuchsia, and I think her last scene as well.
I think it is. And she has one more scene after that, and it's the really tragic one.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I mean, it's just that the confrontation of Steerpike's last gambit, essentially, where he tries to woo her again and win her over. Mm-hmm. Just everything about the intensity of that and the eroticism of it. Yeah. Because there is an undeniable sexual charge between those two beautiful people.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. And
so much of it is so complexly to do with class in a way that he plays on mostly knowingly, but I think there's things simmering in him as well, which are, the way in which he woos her in a more subtle, largely more subtle way than he does like Clarice and Cora, and it's more intertwined with sex and with her desire and her kind of. There's almost like within Fuchsia, and I think Neve McIntosh brings this out really well, is she's got a kind of self-loathing of her class and Gormenghast as well, but it's just not as well, it's not as to the surface as Titus is. So when Steerpike says his stuff about equality and when he sort of confronts her with the opulence around her and talks about her family's privilege and things like that, there's a part of her that wants to buy into that, I think.
Well, in that scene, he almost does it, doesn't he? He actually does woo her with that promise. He does tell her, I will make you my queen, and she's almost going for it. She's almost. You could almost imagine at that point she could turn. She could turn on her family. She could turn on her mother. She could actually set herself up as the new countess, the queen of Gormenghast, and actually find some romance in that. But he makes a mistake. He makes an error. It's slightly different in the book. In fact, that scene doesn't occur in the book. It's an earlier one where she turns on him. He calls her. It's when he calls her stupid. When they are engaging in their forbidden dalliances, when he's still secretary, and she comes to see him with a candle, and he drags her into the room and calls her stupid. That's the point in the book where she's like, we're done. We're done. That's it. How dare you, kitchen boy.
But in that last scene, it's the fact, because I think he actually the camera's quite discreet about it, the way it's framed. But like I think he actually puts his hand on her breast, I think, and she reacts kind of ecstatically. And it's in that moment of physical, probably the most physical intimacy she's ever had, where he then uses the intimate Fuchsia address, and that's what kicks her off. It's almost like part of her subconscious is looking for an excuse to get out of this, or like to not commit to it, to be essentially. I'm not saying joining Steerpike and running away with Steerpike would be a good idea. Or moral or anything, but it's almost like there's a cowardly part of her that doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, it's kind of the programming of Gormenghast, isn't it? Rising up to defend itself, It's the part of her that is Lady Fuchsia, the princess, the would-be countess of Gormenghast, rising up against the impertinence, the presumption of this kitchen boy, defending itself.
When you see that there's a sort of Princess Margaret essence in that as well, isn't there? That kind of, not to make it so personal about one woman, but the kind of sidelined and ignored and disrespected element of a royal family that nevertheless can't leave the cage.
Yeah, and of course it creates such conflict in her that she can't take it anymore. She can't handle it, and she does become probably the most tragic character in the entire thing, to be honest, with the possible exception of Kida, who isn't in the adaptation as much as she is in the book.
Yeah, that's right. This is the nursemaid, the sort of wet nurse of Titus.
That's right. From the Carver tribes. In fact, there's a great wodge of the book that explores Kida's life and how she comes to be Titus's wet nurse and why she was ejected from the Carvers and their society. There's actually a lot more explanation of what the Carvers are like, and they are very separate from Gormenghast. They're very separate from it. They have very little conception of what actually goes on in above stairs. You know, they have very little conception of it. All they really know is those are our betters. They may as well be gods or angels, you know, that they offer up their carvings to.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I was going to talk to you in terms of a possible deficiency of the adaptation. One thing I was thinking in terms of the structure of the show, this is when it comes to the end, I guess, like episodes 3 and 4, which adapt Gormenghast, the book, rather than Titus Groan. On rewatch, I was thinking it's quite an odd decision. I was mainly thinking this because I was watching episode 4, and episode 4 is so packed. Yeah. And obviously, like, the back half of it's taken up with the flood and all the action throughout that. But a lot else has to happen as well. Like, so when episode 4 opens, Barkentine isn't even dead yet.
Right.
One thing I was thinking that would be a much more natural end to episode 3, which actually ends with Titus Groan, you know, looking up through the bars and stuff like that. Wouldn't you have the death of Barkentine happen then?
The death of Barkentine would probably have been a much more natural ending, to be honest. It's an odd thing, because in the book, that death happens, I believe, a little earlier than it's set in the TV adaptation. Again, it's one of those things that they just shift around for pacing, you know, for pacing reasons. But the ending of episode 3, where you've got Titus looking up out of the bars, is not quite as impactful, is it? You know, you have
and also you wouldn't have to do it as a cliffhanger necessarily. You could do it as a cliffhanger. You could have Steerpike and Barkentine both flying out the window, and you don't realise who's survived of either of them till the next one.
Right.
But you could also play around with the sort of Phantom of the Opera like disfigurement of Steerpike. So from episode 3, you wouldn't see him then for maybe the first 5 minutes of episode 4, and then you could have the reveal that he's got this mask.
You could actually you could frame it in a very dramatic way, couldn't you? You know, I mean, in the book, the mask doesn't exist, and I think actually it's a good thing. I think it really works well in the BBC adaptation. But he just wears his scars. In the book, he just wears his scars, and he is very badly disfigured in the book. I think in the book more profoundly than he is in the BBC adaptation.
Yeah, it's a Game of Thrones, you know, Tyrion getting his nose cut off kind of
thing. It's very profound. So what that does, of course, is that sets up more of a tension between him and Fuchsia, because they don't even really embark on this strange romance as such until after he's burned, which is fascinating, isn't it?
Well, we haven't talked as much about the aesthetics of the show as I would have liked, but one thing that came across in the making of documentary, apart from things like, you know, them trying to base Gormenghast, you know, the castle of Gormenghast on kind of more Asiatic influences because of, you know, Peake's upbringing.
Yes, they went into Mervyn Peake's past, didn't they? So they actually introduced sort of like influences from his time in the East, which is
like Tibet and stuff.
And I can actually see that in the architecture of Gormenghast. It's very clever. It's very clever.
I suppose the Steerpike mask thing is almost an example of that, isn't it? Because on the making of featurette, they point out how much they're trying to emulate a bunch of like iconic everything from sort of surrealist early expressionist movies to 20th century artworks and stuff like that. And I suppose, I mean, this is me being a slight Philistine, but maybe you know, it's hard to say that Steerpike's mask is not meant to emulate the Phantom of the Opera.
The Phantom of the Opera, it's a sort of Lon Chaney moment, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's absolutely the case. They are going, and he even looks like there's an echo of the Phantom in terms of character in Steerpike as well, isn't there? You know,
that's true. There is.
It does make sense.
It's like I mean, there's an echo in Phantom in the sense that he's this figure who's been tortured by this institution and this building, but can't leave it.
Right, and ultimately is a destructive influence from below. You know, it makes enormous sense, that poetry, that resonance.
So it's quite evocative of that, yeah. No, I mean, I actually, just the final thing in this bit, like before we move on to the text of it, I really wanted to lavish much more praise on the music.
The music is gorgeous. It's
insanely intense,
gorgeous. Isn't it? The opening title, for example, is actually from Peake's books. You know, it's one of the poems of Gormenghast that had music added to it, and it's stunning. I mean, because the show is kind of evocative of a time in my life that was so full of stuff happening. You know, it's early 20s. Yours too, I imagine. You know, it's early 20s, it's university, it's stuff going on, it's the world efflorescing. It does sort of excite me in a very profound way. It sends all the, you know, my hackles going up, and it excites very particular association. But even aside from that context, it's just a gorgeous bit of work.
Well, I mean, that scene that we discussed where Fuchsia's talking to Ian Richardson, Neve McIntosh is talking to Ian Richardson in his garden, you could turn the dialogue off, take the dialogue soundtrack out, and just listen to the sweeping score in that scene. And it's like... it's sort of operatic, but it is like one of those silent movies that you have this score set to. I could enjoy it on that level, and so much of it's done like a silent movie as well, with these intense close-ups and their big dark eyes, and those kind of mise en scène configurations that remind you of Buñuel movies and Griffiths movies and things.
For me, it's when towards the end, when you're getting all of the denouements of the various different subplots all tying together, and the score swells. It just becomes absolutely operatic, and it really does crescendo when Titus leaps out the window and slides down the ivy. When you get the heroic moment, I suppose, that's when you get the trumpets coming in, and it actually becomes almost classically fantastical in a way, like redolent of the Lord of the Rings soundtracks in many respects.
It's a very overwhelming show, isn't it? Like, you were saying about, people turning on casually and switching off because it was too weird, but it's a lot, isn't it? Like, I mean, it is a lot. I don't mean that to deride it, obviously, because I love it, but it's quite full on. Yeah,
and I think that's kind of why I loved it so much at that period, because I've always had this thing, and it comes from my Clive Barker influence, whereby I only want media and stories that make me feel things, that make me feel profoundly. Otherwise, I don't see the point. I just don't see the point. And this show that is so intense and so full of tension and drama and so much going on, and stimuli, raw stimuli, colours, music, sound, it just, I could not go for it. It was tailor-made for me, I think.
I think that enthusiasm comes across, I was going to say on this rewatch, what really struck me as very odd was, because you were talking before about the way the adaptation doesn't convey the passage of time as smoothly or as clearly either, really. And I think part of that's casting, actually, because I was thinking, the fact that they cast a younger Titus in episode 3 and then an older one in episode 4, they could easily do a similar thing with Steerpike and Fuchsia, couldn't they?
They could. I mean, they tried to do it with things like makeup, clothing, that kind of thing, to make them look a little bit older, but it's kind of clear that they're pretty much the same age as they were,
Yeah, and it's a shame because I think with Neve McIntosh, for example, I think she doesn't work as well as the Fuchsia that's meant to be about 14, 15.
Right.
But she works really well as a sort of child woman who actually is Neve McIntosh's age at the time.
Well, she works so well. I mean, what I love is the way she switches all the way through between those two conflicting elements of herself. So at times you get Fuchsia the woman, or the woman that could be, and then you get Fuchsia the child again coming through. It's so wonderful, and she captures that perfectly.
Well, no one's, like you were sort of hinting at this, but no one's fully grown in this, aren't they? Like, no one's had the room to grow. I suppose you could say maybe apart from Gertrude, who has all the room she thinks she needs.
Right. And also just the opportunity, having, being at the very top of the pile. She has the opportunity. The part of that is Gormenghast itself, of course. Gormenghast naturally stunts people. It requires very particular things of them within the functions that it prescribes for them. And woe betide you if you ever try to step outside of that,
And by the end of the show and the book, obviously the space itself is shrinking, and they actually, because of the flood. Which I mean, looking back at this, if this was an expensive BBC production, flooding all your sets towards the end for one episode must count as pretty difficult and expensive and probably quite dangerous as well.
I've no doubt.
But I mean, Gertrude actually makes a point, doesn't she? Of Rockcod comes and reports that Gormenghast is being progressively flooded, and she's like, good, because they're currently looking for Steerpike, so it shrinks the spaces you can be in. And that's very video gamey, isn't it? Think of any number of platform games where you have to leap to avoid the water that's rising up,
It really is. It's very, very video gamey, and also sort of very mythological as well. There's something of the pathetic fallacy about this, isn't there? It's almost like Gormenghast itself is reacting to Steerpike. It's so weird. It's almost like you could read it in one of two ways. You could read it as the slow destruction of Gormenghast as Steerpike's poison sets in. Or you could read it as Gormenghast trying to defend itself against... flushing him out. Which is what it does. Without that flood, he would have almost certainly won. Even
the sort of white blood cells, even reluctantly co-opted ones like Titus to complete the action. It's funny, your misspeak of Typhus Grown before. It reminded me of which I'm definitely changing my Twitter name to. I think
Typhus
with all due
Grown,
respect.
Yeah.
I wouldn't take that off you. What I was going to mention is when I think it's in episode 3 when Clarice and Cora have disappeared, presumed suicide by water, and then you find out that Steerpike's actually locked them away in that horrible dungeon.
That's a vile moment. I remember when I first saw that, and when you see them just sat there and they've been gnawed and they've not moved. They've just sat waiting for something. Yeah.
And their makeup's all kind of greasy and even more caked on and decayed than it was. And it's but do you remember he in the adaptation at least he phrases that specifically in terms of keeping them in lockdown?
Yeah. Oh yes, he actually tells them that there's a virus, that there's a pandemic in Gormenghast, and he plays it, doesn't he? He's actually being very theatrical. Yeah. Yeah, I love
that. That Gertrude also is in lockdown, and they're like hoping. And doesn't he say they're like, "It's Gertrude still lives then?" And he's like, "Well, Fuchsia's got a bit of a cough."
Yeah. He's stringing them along as far as he possibly can, isn't he? Isolating them. It's quite brilliant. And of course, I mean, it doesn't really take much, to be honest, with Clarice and Cora, because they're not the brightest, are they? They're not the sharpest.
No, but that's the thing where again. Talking about me and Kit's conversation about the Crown, this is the thing where even these idiots trapped in these situations, you can feel great sympathy for because they are trapped in these situations. There's a sort of basic human empathy for people in traps, right?
Oh, right. I think it's awful. I mean, what happens ultimately to Clarice and Cora is hideous. That last scene when you actually do discover them, when Prune, Squalor, Flay and Titus are following Steerpike, and he goes, again, a mistake of ego, because he goes to crow around his conquest. Oh, this is the aristocracy. This is what they come to when they challenge me. It's a mistake. He wouldn't have been discovered. There wouldn't have been any witnesses,
He quotes a bit of Hamlet in that as well, which raises some interesting questions about where they've got Shakespeare from in this world.
Right. I mean, there are a few lines in the BBC adaptation, actually, where it's like, so... where is this set then? There's a line that Prune Squalor has, when Steerpike first ascends to working for the sisters come to Prune Squalor's quarters for something or other, and immediately Steerpike says, "Oh, aristocracy, I'll latch on to them." And Prune Squalor sees it and he goes, "Climbs faster than a Virginia creeper."
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's true.
So Virginia exists in this world then.
Yeah, just Virginia and the complete works of Shakespeare. Yeah. That's the only two things that exist in this world from our world.
Very strange, but all right. Fair
well, it has
enough.
I mean, that ties it to things like Narnia, like Lewis's Narnia a bit, doesn't it? In the sense that, we were talking a bit before about, things like Father Christmas famously intruding into the Land of Witch Wardrobe, and in that sense it being kind of a quote-unquote vulgar fantasy for, for people like Tolkien and his successors who take that stuff very, very seriously, the non-intrusive world.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, Tolkien was notoriously quite unpleasant about the Chronicles of Narnia. Notoriously so. Even though they were friends, him and C.S. Lewis were actually contemporaries and friends. He was not that enthusiastic about the Chronicles of Narnia.
That's the sort of argument where temperamentally I wouldn't like to defend Lewis, but another part of me would want to hit Tolkien in the face with a big custard pie.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, it's an odd one, isn't it? You've got this one guy writing about hobbits and balrogs and whatnot, criticizing this other guy for writing about fauns and witches and talking lions and whatnot. Yeah.
Gatekeeping is always gatekeeping.
There's a slight gatekeeping element to it, definitely. But no, when you do see Clarice and Cora sat there and they're just the skeletons, and it's clear from looking at them, they haven't even moved around, they haven't clawed at the door or anything, they've just sat there and rotted and starved. It's like, oh my God, that's hideous.
Yeah, it's really awful, isn't it? I realise, as our time is going relatively short, we should probably mention Christopher Lee a little bit more than we have done today.
Christopher Lee's Flay.
And not just because he's great in this, but also because he's such a horror legend but also because he was a peak mega fan, wasn't he?
Yeah, he is. He's actually generally a fan of this tradition in British fantasy. I mean, he was a huge Tolkien fan as well. I mean, for him, it was like the best thing to be cast in The Lord of the Rings and to have been cast in Gormenghast as well. He was a huge fan. So to be able to play, I think he actually originally went for Sepulcrave. Which I'm sure he would have been great in, But I think he works as Flay beautifully just because of his stature.
This would be like the equivalent, from what I know of your test, George, this would be like the equivalent of you getting to be in 2 of your favourite Clive Barker adaptations, God. 2 years back to back.
Yeah. Essentially, he, towards the end of his career, I suppose, towards the end of his life, he managed to get into two adaptations of 2 of his favourite books ever written. So it's a beautiful thing in many respects. And of course, because of that connection, because he understands the world so well, which all the actors seem to actually, he just inhabits that character. He's perfect as Flay.
He does, doesn't he? What a look that is as well, with his waistcoats with the sort of gold pinnings
and the dust.
The sort of straw-like hair,
He's got like all the dust on him as well. Whenever he moves, there's dust coming off of him and it's all over him and he's glittering with it. What I love about the performance more than anything is the physicality of it. Because in the book, Flay is described as being like a scarecrow. He moves in this very mechanical, awkward, shuffling way. In fact, in the book, he's even got there's an audible quality to it. All of his joints pop and crack when he moves. And Christopher Lee just gets it. He gets it beautifully. I mean, can you imagine being Jonathan Rhys Meyers playing against Christopher Lee when you're that young?
I mean, there must have been a ton of that, though, right? Like Niamh McIntosh against Ian Richardson, that kind of stuff. It must have been like a fantasy training camp almost.
It must have been intimidating.
But then again, Warren Mitchell, obviously not a young man then, talks about it like that in the making of. He says, like, everyone I've ever wanted to work with is here. Almost like he's hallucinating, he's tripping. It's just like, look, over there is John Sessions.
One thing I would love, I mean, one of the things I would hope to accomplish through this podcast, through anything, is elevating the status of this adaptation. So people go and watch it, because there's so much good stuff in it. There's so much good. Whatever faults or flaws that it might have, are overridden by, I believe, the sheer passion of it. I think it's very clear that the people involved in this loved it. They loved it. They enjoyed doing it. And that's from the actors to the directors to the incredible costumes, the lighting, the sets. It's an amazing piece of work, and it angers me that it's not better regarded or more well remembered.
And more available in this day and age. Honestly, it's ridiculous. I'm honestly thinking about writing for the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, come on.
Yeah,
there is
I'll send a few tweets.
Have you heard there is a new adaptation of Gormenghast apparently in production, and Neil Gaiman is writing the script apparently.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, he's like in meetings about it apparently. Yeah. Well, one reading up about adaptations of it. Not only did I read about the apparently fairly well known and well lauded 1980s radio adaptation, which had Sting as
Steerpike. Yeah, apparently so. Yeah.
So Sting was in Dune and Gormenghast.
And Gormenghast, yeah.
Wow.
The funny thing is, I can see that. I don't know why. That rings true in my mind. I don't know why.
Well, apparently there was also a 2011 radio adaptation, and it has a pretty impressive cast list, but the only one I can remember is Tamsin Greig, is I think Irma.
I can so see that. I can so see that. I've got to seek that out.
A lot to catch up with. I'm certainly going to give those both a listen, at least for their episode 1s, and just see how they kind of spin it.
Definitely.
I think I want to wrap up shortly, George, because it's getting on a bit, and I've kept you too long, arguably. But I've really enjoyed talking at length about this, and as you were saying, talking about the other you could probably do another one just on this adaptation.
Totally,
actually,
we really could. I could kepe going, definitely. I could do another episode, definitely.
But I'd love to have you back on the show in the future to talk about other things that fascinate you, and other things that hopefully I think of interesting things to say about as well.
It would be my absolute pleasure. I'd love to.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, George. Well, we'll reconvene sometime then in this most awful of years, 2021.
2021. Yeah.
Plenty of time left to fill. Well, thanks. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 26. And George, would you like to tell people where they can find you online?
Oh, sure. Yes, you can find me on YouTube at Exaggerated Elegy, where I do Let's Plays and various different podcasts and whatever really takes my fancy, to be perfectly honest. You can find links to all of my published fiction over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And if you fancy a natter, you can come and find me over at Twitter on Enigmatic Elegy.
Excellent. Thank you for letting the people know.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And that's all from us. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @deep_Fagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.